There is a particular kind of night that belongs only to London in late autumn, when the fog does not so much fall as arrive, settling over the rooftops like a grey shawl drawn up to the chin of the city, and every gas lamp along the street becomes a small, soft moon, glowing without quite illuminating anything at all. It is on such a night that I ask you to join me now. Picture, if you will, the sitting room at 221B Baker Street. The fire is low but steady, throwing its orange light across the worn Persian rug, across the walls lined with books that have never quite been dusted to Mrs. Hudson's satisfaction, across the violin, resting untouched in its case in the corner. Somewhere below, a kettle has just been set upon the stove, and the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the thin substitute so many London households had grown used to, drifts faintly up the stairs. You are welcome here. You have always been welcome here. Settle back. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the sounds of your own evening fall away, and let the sounds of ours take their place. The crackle of coal, the distant clatter of a hansom cab on wet cobblestones, the low murmur of a city settling in for the night. If you like, close your eyes now and simply listen. You need not follow every word to follow the shape of the story. You need only let it carry you, the way a slow tide carries a boat that has already dropped its anchor for the night. My name is John Watson, and before I let sleep take you, I want to tell you about a winter that began, of all things, with a lantern. Not a grand mystery at first, not a body in a locked room, nor a scream in the night, only a small point of light in the window of a house that everyone in the street knew, with absolute certainty, to be empty. But certainty, as Holmes was fond of reminding me, is very often just a comfortable word for the truth we have not yet examined closely enough. I have told you a great many stories over the years, stories of blood and violence, of desperate men and desperate crimes, of the darker corners London keeps tucked away behind its respectable brick fronts. This is not, in the end, quite that sort of story, though it wears that sort of shape for a good while before it shows you its true face. This is a story about patience, about the particular kind of courage it takes to trust that a quiet truth, left carefully burning in the dark, will eventually be found by someone willing to look for it. It is, I think, one of the gentlest cases Holmes and I ever worked together, however frightening it seemed to the good people of our own street while it was unfolding around them. And I have always found that the gentlest stories make, in the end, the very best company for a quiet night such as this one. So let yourself grow comfortable now, and let me tell you what happened at number 14. Number 1. The house across the street. It stood almost directly opposite our own windows, separated from 221B only by the width of Baker Street itself and a few paces of pavement. A tall, narrow house of dark brick, its curtains drawn, its brass fittings gone dull with a year's neglect. Number 14 had belonged, until the previous winter, to a Mr. Josiah Trevelyan, a man whom I confess I had passed on the street perhaps a dozen times without ever exchanging more than a nod. He had been, by the account of the neighbourhood, an unusual sort of gentleman, 60 years of age or thereabouts, broad through the shoulders in the manner of a man who had once done real labour, with a close-cropped grey beard and eyes that Mrs. Hudson, who had known him slightly through the ordinary commerce of a shared street, once described as kind but always watching, as though he expected the worst of people and hoped to be wrong. His story, as I came to learn it, was one of those quiet, self-made histories that London swallows by the hundred without ever quite noticing them. He had been born the son of a Bristol dockhand in a narrow house that smelled always of tar and salt water, and had gone to work in a shipwright's yard at the age of 11, cleaning brass fittings until his hands bled and his knuckles hardened into something closer to leather than skin. It was there, among the coiled ropes and the half-built hulls, that he had first learned the trade that would make his fortune, the manufacture of ship's lanterns, simple, sturdy, honest devices, built to survive a gale and to be trusted absolutely by men whose lives depended upon their light. He had a gift for it. By 25, he had his own small workshop. By 40, he had moved his business to London to be nearer the great shipping concerns of the Thames, and had built, brass fitting by brass fitting, an enterprise substantial enough to see him settled at last into a house on Baker Street, a street that, in his own dry words, recorded once in a letter Eleanor later showed to Holmes, a boy from the Bristol docks had no earthly business owning, and every earthly right to. He had never married. There had been, by the vague and half-remembered account of an elderly neighbour, some sweetheart in his youth who had died young of a fever, and Trevelyan had simply never replaced her in his affections, choosing instead to pour whatever tenderness he possessed into his business, his ledgers, and, in the final 15 years of his life, into a niece he had never expected to raise. His household, at the time of his death, had consisted of a housekeeper, a manservant, and that niece, Miss Eleanor Trevelyan, an orphan he had taken in when she was but 15 years old, and who had lived with him ever since as, by every account, a devoted and beloved companion. It was said, by those who had known the household best, that the old man's face changed entirely when she entered a room, that the watchfulness Mrs. Hudson had noted in his eyes softened, just slightly, into something nearer to hope. He had died the previous November, in his own study, seated in his own chair, before his own fire. The physician's certificate had recorded the cause as failure of the heart, sudden, painless, and, given the old man's age and the physical demands of his younger years, entirely unremarkable. There had been no scandal, no suspicion, no occasion, indeed, for anyone to think of Josiah Trevelyan's death as anything other than what it appeared to be, the quiet ending of a long and productive life. Miss Trevelyan, grieving and, as I would later learn, deeply unsettled by the house itself, had not remained in it. She had taken rooms elsewhere in London within a month of the funeral, and number 14 had stood shuttered and silent ever since, its fate tied up in the slow machinery of probate, its rooms left exactly as they had been on the night the old man died. The housekeeper had been given a generous pension and sent to live with a sister in Croydon. The manservant had found a new position in Mayfair, and the house itself had simply gone dark, as houses do, when the life that once filled them departs and no new life has yet arrived to take its place. That, at least, was the story as I understood it in the early weeks of that winter. A small, sad, ordinary story of the kind that happens on every street in London and is forgotten within a season. I had heard it, in fact, almost entirely from Mrs. Hudson, who possessed, as most good landladies do, an encyclopedic knowledge of every household within sight of her own front step, and who related it to me one evening over nothing more sinister than a discussion of the coming winter's coal prices. It did not remain ordinary for very long. Number 2. The first sighting. It was Mrs. Hudson who brought it to our attention, though I do not believe she intended to. She had come up one evening with our supper, and I noticed that she set the tray down with rather more force than the occasion required, and that her hands, usually so steady, trembled faintly as she arranged the plates. "Is something troubling you, Mrs. Hudson?" I asked. She hesitated, the particular hesitation of a sensible woman who does not wish to say something foolish, and is annoyed with herself for being tempted to say it regardless. "It's nothing, Doctor. Only, well, you'll think me a silly old woman. I promise you I will think no such thing." She glanced toward the window, toward the dark shape of number 14 across the street, and lowered her voice, as though the house itself might overhear her. "There's a light in there, some nights, not every night, but often enough that I've begun to watch for it." Holmes, who had appeared entirely absorbed in a chemical treatise until that moment, did not so much as lift his eyes from the page. "A light in an empty house is very often a burglar, Mrs. Hudson, and very rarely a matter for alarm. I should inform the police, if it troubles you." "I have," she said, with the particular firmness of a woman who has been made to feel foolish once already, and does not intend to feel foolish twice. "Constable Reeves has looked into it himself. He says the house is locked exactly as it should be, every door, every window. He says there's no sign anyone's been inside at all." "Then the light is imagined," said Holmes, turning a page. "It is not imagined, Mr. Holmes." There was an edge in her voice now, quiet but unmistakable. "I have seen it with my own eyes. So has the greengrocer's boy. So has old Mr. Fenwick at number 9. And he is not a man given to fancies, as you well know. It comes at 11 o'clock. Always 11. Never a minute before, never a minute after. And it is not the sort of light a burglar carries. It does not move about the house, searching for silver. It appears in the window of the study, Mr. Trevelyan's own study, and it simply burns, steady and warm and yellow. And then, sometime before dawn, it is gone again, and no one has ever seen it go out. She left us shortly after, and for a time, neither Holmes nor I spoke. I confess, I did not think of the matter again that evening, not until, some hours later, restless and unable to sleep, I rose and crossed to the window to look out upon the street. The fog had thinned. Baker Street lay quiet beneath a scattering of stars, the gas lamps burning their small, patient light along the pavement. I glanced, without any particular purpose, toward number 14, and there, in the upper window, the window of what I would soon learn was Josiah Trevelyan's study. A lantern was burning. It was not the harsh white glare of an electric light, nor the flat glow of gas. It had the warm, slightly unsteady quality of an old-fashioned oil flame, the kind of light I had not seen inside a London house in years, the kind of light that belongs to ships and stables and the studies of men who distrust newer inventions. It sat perfectly still in the black rectangle of the window, as though someone had set it upon a desk and simply walked away. I stood watching it for what must have been 10 minutes, and in all that time, nothing in the house stirred. No shadow crossed the glow, no figure passed before it. It simply burned, silent and patient, in a house that every soul on Baker Street would have sworn, under oath, to be empty. I woke Holmes. Number 3. What the street believed. I ought to say something here of the shape that fear took along our street in the days that followed. For it is easy, telling a story afterward and knowing its ending, to forget how genuinely unsettled a neighborhood can become over something so small as a light in a window. Baker Street was not, by nature, a superstitious place. It was a street of professional men and tradesmen, of solicitors and doctors, and the occasional retired officer of Her Majesty's service, not the sort of company one associates with talk of ghosts. And yet, within a fortnight of my own sighting, I had heard the lantern discussed, in one form or another, by no fewer than 6 of our neighbours, each account differing slightly in its particulars and agreeing entirely in its unease. The greengrocer's boy, a freckled lad of perhaps 13 named Tommy Wick, told anyone who would listen that he had seen a shape pass before the light, one evening, while delivering a late order 2 doors down, though under Holmes's later and rather more exacting questioning, the shape resolved itself into nothing more substantial than the reflection of his own lantern swinging in his hand. Old Mr. Fenwick, a retired schoolmaster of exacting and unromantic habits, reported that he had taken to timing the light by his own pocket watch on 3 separate occasions, and that it had appeared, without variation, at 11 o'clock precisely each time, a detail he delivered with the grim satisfaction of a man who prides himself on being believed. Even the postman had begun, by his own sheepish admission, to complete his final round of the street, rather more briskly than the distance strictly required. The talk, inevitably, turned to Josiah Trevelyan himself, and here the neighborhood's collective memory performed the peculiar alchemy that grief and time so often work upon the recently dead, softening a man remembered, in life, as somewhat stern and private, into something altogether more mysterious and haunted in death. There were murmurs of an unhappy end, murmurs, even, of a debt unpaid, a wrong undone, though no one could say precisely what debt or what wrong, only that a man did not simply die quietly in his chair and then continue, apparently, to keep his study lit of an evening, unless something in the manner of his passing had gone unfinished. I do not repeat this gossip to lend it any credit. I repeat it only because it forms, I think, an essential part of the atmosphere in which our investigation began, a neighborhood already half convinced, before Holmes had examined a single fact, that something uncanny had settled over number 14, and more than willing to believe whatever explanation asked the least of their reason and the most of their imagination. It is a testament to Holmes's peculiar temperament that he found this atmosphere not the least bit contagious, and rather more of a nuisance than a mystery, for a full 10 days after Mrs. Hudson first raised the matter. I do not count myself entirely immune to it either, if I am honest in the telling. There is something about a street one knows intimately, every brick, every lamp-post, every familiar face passing on the pavement each morning, that makes a single unexplained thing within it feel very much larger than the same thing would feel a mile away, in a neighborhood one merely passes through. I had walked past number 14 1,000 times without a second thought. I found myself, in those first strange weeks, unable to pass it at all, without glancing up at that dark study window, half dreading and half hoping to see the light burning there in broad daylight, which of course it never did, for whatever hand lit it kept faithfully to its appointed hour and no other. I called, one grey afternoon, upon old Mr. Fenwick himself, more out of a doctor's habitual curiosity about a nervous patient than any real expectation of learning something Holmes had not already gathered. He received me in a small, meticulously ordered sitting room that spoke eloquently of the schoolmaster's temperament even before he himself began to speak. A man who had spent 40 years correcting the careless work of small boys, and who now applied that same exacting eye to the mystery across the street, with what I can only describe as scholarly relish beneath his evident unease. "I do not frighten easily, Doctor," he told me, settling his spectacles with the precision of a man about to deliver a lecture. 41 years in a boy's classroom will cure a man of most ordinary fears, I assure you, for there is very little in this world so genuinely alarming as 40 small boys who have all, simultaneously, decided to test the limits of one's patience on the same wet Tuesday afternoon. But I confess, this business troubles me in a manner I find difficult to categorize. I have timed that light, Doctor, on 11 separate occasions now, by my own pocket watch, which keeps time as faithfully as any chronometer in London, having been serviced twice yearly for the whole of my adult life. It comes at 11 o'clock, not 1 minute before, not 1 minute after. There is a discipline to it that unsettles me rather more than any ghost story would. For a ghost, I have always imagined, would be a careless, wandering sort of thing, moaning about at all hours, rattling whatever chains ghosts are said to favour. This is not carelessness, Doctor. This is a schedule, and I have never yet met the ghost with a proper respect for punctuality. I relayed this observation to Holmes that evening, expecting him to dismiss it as the fanciful embellishment of an old man with too much time and too precise a pocket watch. He did not dismiss it at all. "Fenwick has hit upon something rather more useful than he realizes, Watson," he said, setting down his pipe. "A ghost, as he says, would be careless, bound by no schedule but its own restless wandering. A living man, entering a house by some difficult and secret passage, keeps to a schedule for a very particular reason, because he cannot risk arriving either too early, while some passer-by might yet be abroad on the street to notice him slipping into a supposedly empty house, nor too late, lest his own absence from wherever he is expected to be at that hour become itself a matter someone else troubles to notice. 11 o'clock, Watson, is neither so late that the streets have fallen entirely silent and empty, which would make an unaccustomed figure abroad in the fog more conspicuous, not less, nor so early that a busy professional man's evening engagements have not yet concluded. It is, if you consider it carefully, very nearly the ideal hour for a man to slip away from his own household or his own club, under some perfectly ordinary pretext, attend to an hour's secret business, and return again before anyone has troubled to mark the length of his absence. You believe he has calculated the hour deliberately? I believe, Watson, that everything about this case, examined closely enough, reveals itself to be the product of calculation rather than accident, which is precisely why I have found it, from the very first night you woke me, rather more interesting than I permitted either you or the street at large to believe. Number 4. A curious indifference. I expected, I confess, a rather different reaction than the one I received when I woke Holmes that first night. He came to the window in his dressing gown, looked across at the lit study for perhaps 3 seconds, and then returned to his chair by the fire with an expression of mild irritation, as though I had woken him to observe nothing more remarkable than a change in the weather. A lamp, Watson. Someone has lit a lamp in an empty house, a locked house, according to Mrs. Hudson and the good constable both. Empty houses accumulate all manner of persons who ought not to be there. Vagrants find their way in through coal chutes and forgotten cellar doors with a regularity that would astonish you. I see no mystery in it whatsoever. And the hour, always 11 precisely. Coincidence, or else the fellow keeps regular habits, which would make him an unusually disciplined sort of trespasser. He waved a hand, as if to dismiss both the lantern and the conversation together. I have 3 cases of genuine interest awaiting my attention this month, Watson. A forged bond in the city, a missing racehorse in Surrey, and a rather promising blackmail in Kensington. I have no leisure to spend upon Mrs. Hudson's ghost stories. I own that his indifference surprised me, and, I will admit now, it very slightly disappointed me, for I had already begun to feel the particular prickle of curiosity that a good mystery produces in an idle mind. But Holmes was not a man to be moved by prickles of curiosity that were not his own, and so the matter rested, for a time, exactly where he had left it. For the better part of a week, Holmes maintained his pose of disinterest so thoroughly that I very nearly believed it myself. He went about his ordinary business, the forged bond, the racehorse, the Kensington blackmailer, with every appearance of a man whose mind was entirely elsewhere. He made no mention of number 14. He did not so much as glance toward its windows when we came and went from our own door. I recall one particular afternoon when he returned in high spirits, having recovered the stolen bond through a piece of reasoning so elegant that I resolved, then and there, to set it down in these very pages one day, and not once, in the whole of that evening's celebratory conversation, did the lantern across the street so much as cross his lips. And yet I began to notice small things. He took to smoking his pipe by the window in the evenings, in a chair he had never before favoured for that purpose, a chair that happened to command an excellent view of the house across the street. He asked Mrs. Hudson, with an air of only passing interest, precisely which nights she had seen the light, and made her account for each one against the almanac, as though the phase of the moon might have some bearing on the matter, or the tides upon the Thames, or the schedule of the last omnibus. I noted, too, that he had begun taking a slightly circuitous route on his morning walks, one that carried him past the mews and back gardens behind Baker Street, rather than along the pavement itself, a route that would have brought him, had I troubled to trace it upon a map, directly behind the garden wall of number 14. And one grey afternoon, while I was occupied with a patient, he was gone from our rooms for nearly 3 hours, returning with mud upon his boots of a particular reddish clay that I happened to recognize, having once treated a gardener's cut hand not 2 streets away as belonging to a very particular sort of London soil, the sort found in only a handful of garden plots within half a mile of us, of which the small, neglected plot behind number 14 was one. I said nothing of my observations. I had learned, over the years, that Holmes revealed his hand only when he judged the moment right, and that pressing him before that moment served no purpose beyond irritating us both. But I began, quietly, to keep my own small notes, a habit I had developed over years of chronicling his cases, and one that would serve me rather well, I think, in setting down this account for you now. The moment came on a Thursday evening, some 10 days after Mrs. Hudson had first spoken to us, when Holmes set down his pipe, turned from the window, and said, without any preamble whatsoever, I should like your opinion on a locked room, Watson. Fetch your coat." We stepped out into a London I have always found peculiarly beautiful in its own bleak way. The London of a winter evening, when the ordinary bustle of the day has withdrawn indoors and left the streets to fog and gaslight, and the occasional hurrying figure with collar turned up against the damp. Baker Street itself lay nearly silent, the shop fronts shuttered, a single hansom cab rattling away toward Oxford Street and leaving in its wake only the steady drip of moisture from the eaves and the muffled, distant hum of a city that never entirely sleeps, however quiet its individual streets may grow. "You have been unusually active this past week for a man claiming no interest in the matter," I remarked, as we crossed toward number 14's dark front step. "I have been active in a great many small matters, Watson, none of which, taken individually, would strike an observer as connected to Mrs. Hudson's lantern at all. That is rather the point of careful investigation. I have always found not the single dramatic gesture that announces itself to the world, but the quiet accumulation of 100 small and separately unremarkable observations, each one meaningless alone and devastating in combination. I have walked this street at every hour of the day and night this past week, Watson, though you observed me doing so only on the occasions I permitted myself to be observed. I have learned the habits of every constable on this beat, the schedule of every tradesman's cart, the precise moment each evening when the last light in every house within sight of number 14 is customarily extinguished. None of it, individually, would interest a jury. All of it, together, has told me a very great deal about the sort of man we are hunting, and the sort of hour he is most likely to choose. And what sort of man is that, in your present estimation?" Holmes paused a moment before the dark bulk of the house, his breath clouding faintly in the cold air. "A careful one, Watson, a patient one, a man who has, I think, spent the whole of his adult life believing himself several steps ahead of everyone around him, and who has only recently, within this past year, I should think, discovered what it feels like to be genuinely, thoroughly afraid. I find that combination, in my experience, produces the most dangerous sort of criminal there is. Not the reckless brute who acts from simple passion and is caught, very often, through his own carelessness within days, but the careful man pushed at last beyond the limits of his own careful nature, who has begun making decisions no longer from calculation, but from raw, cornered fear. Such men are unpredictable in exactly the ways that ordinarily predictable men are not, Watson, and I confess it is that unpredictability, rather more than the locked doors or the mysterious hour, which has genuinely troubled my sleep this past week. Number 5. Number 14. Constable Reeves met us at the door, a broad, patient young man who regarded Holmes with the particular deference that the better sort of policeman reserves for a detective whose reputation has preceded him. He had, it transpired, been persuaded by Holmes some days earlier to allow a private examination of the house on the condition that nothing be disturbed and that the results, whatever they might be shared with the official force. "I'll say this for the place, Mr. Holmes," Reeves said, producing a heavy iron key. "I've been through it twice myself, top to bottom, and I'll stake my pension there's not a soul inside it. Every window's latched from within, every door's bolted, the dust lies thick as a blanket on every stair, and there's not so much as a footprint through it, saving my own and the ones I made last week. You have examined the cellars as thoroughly as the upper floors, Holmes asked, and I noted, though I thought nothing of it at the time, a particular sharpness in the question. As thorough as I know how, sir. Coal cellar, wine cellar, the little scullery passage beneath the kitchen. All locked, all undisturbed. If a man's getting in and out of this house, he's doing it by magic, and I don't hold with magic. Nor do I, Constable. I hold, as a rule, only with facts I have not yet fully gathered. Shall we begin? We entered. I will confess that even I, a man not given to superstition, felt something settle over my shoulders as we stepped across that threshold. Not fear, precisely, but a kind of hush, the particular stillness of a house that has been holding its breath for a year. The hall smelled of dust and cold stone, and something faintly beneath that, beeswax polish perhaps, from furniture no one had touched in 12 months, or the ghost of a fire that had not been lit since the night its master died. The dust lay exactly as Reeves had described it, an even grey film across the hall floor, disturbed only by a narrow, well-trodden path where the constable's own boots had passed, again and again, on his rounds of inspection. Holmes examined this path with care, then moved beyond it to the untouched dust along the skirting boards, crouching low with his lens, saying nothing. We passed first through the ground floor, a dining room, its table still laid with a single unused place, setting the housekeeper had apparently forgotten to clear before her final departure, the silver gone dull and spotted. A small morning room, curtains drawn tight. A kitchen, cold and echoing, its copper pans still hanging in their accustomed rows. Everything spoke of a household paused mid-motion, as though the whole house had simply stopped, one November evening, and had not yet found the will to start again. We climbed to the study. It was a handsome room, or had been, a broad desk still littered with the old man's papers, shelves of ledgers and marine charts, a cold and long-dead fire in the grate, a single worn leather armchair angled toward the hearth in the manner of a man who liked, of an evening, to sit and simply think. Upon the walls hung 2 framed engravings of sailing vessels, and, I noted with a small pang, a modest watercolour, amateur, but affectionately rendered, of a young girl seated in a garden, which I took, correctly as it later proved, to be a portrait of Eleanor Trevelyan, painted in her uncle's own unpractised hand. And upon the desk, precisely in the centre, sat the lantern. It was, I noted at once, an object of some distinction, solid brass, ship-built by the look of it, its glass panes cleaned and polished despite the year of neglect around it, an engraved insignia upon its base that I could not quite make out in the dim light. It was cold. It had, by every appearance, not been lit in weeks. "This is the lamp Mrs. Hudson describes," I asked. "The very one, by her account, and by Fenwick's." Holmes lifted it with great care, turning it in his long fingers, holding it to the window's grey light. "A ship's lantern, Watson, the kind that once hung from the rigging of 100 vessels along the Thames, before gas and electricity made such things obsolete. Trevelyan made his fortune manufacturing precisely these. It would seem fitting that he kept one for himself. Then someone is lighting Trevelyan's own lantern in Trevelyan's own study. At the hour," I stopped. "Go on." "At very nearly the hour, I should think, that he died." Holmes said nothing for a long moment, turning the lantern slowly in the fading light. Then he set it down, exactly where it had stood, and straightened. Constable Reeves. At what hour, precisely, was Mr. Trevelyan found? Reeves consulted a small notebook, though I suspected he knew the answer already. The housekeeper found him at 11:30, sir, when she brought his evening cocoa, but the doctor reckoned he'd been dead the better part of an hour by then. Called it heart failure, and thought no more of it. Nothing irregular about the room, nothing disturbed, no sign of struggle. A peaceful death, by all accounts. A peaceful death, Holmes repeated, very quietly. In a room where a dead man's lantern now lights itself, unassisted, at the very hour he is presumed to have died. He did not say the word murder. He did not need to. I saw the thought settle over his features exactly as the hush had settled over my own shoulders when we first crossed the threshold, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever indifference Holmes had shown me over the past 10 days had been, from the very first night, a lie. Number 6. What the dust could not explain. We remained in that house until nearly midnight, and Holmes's examination, once begun, proceeded with a thoroughness that left even Constable Reeves visibly impressed, and, by the small, private smile he could not quite suppress, rather flattered to have been permitted to witness it. Every door and window in number 14 was found bolted from the inside, every one, without exception, and Holmes confirmed this himself, testing each latch with his own hand, working methodically from the front hall through to the scullery, the pantry, and finally the 2 cellars below. The chimney in the study was too narrow for a grown man to pass, and in any case showed no disturbance in its soot, a fact Holmes confirmed by inserting a slender rod he had brought for the purpose, and finding it emerge as clean as it had gone in. There was, so far as any reasonable examination could determine, no way whatsoever for a living person to enter that house and leave it again unseen. And yet the dust upon the study floor, thick, undisturbed, a full year's accumulation, showed no mark of any foot at all near the desk where the lantern stood. Not Reeves's boots, not Holmes's own, careful as he was to avoid it. Nothing. If a man enters this room each night to light that lamp, I said, he does so without ever setting foot upon the floor. Or, said Holmes, the lamp is not lit by any man who enters the room at all. Not, at least, by the door through which we ourselves entered it. I did not understand him, and he did not explain himself further that night. He spent a further quarter of an hour upon his hands and knees before the study's small side window, a narrow casement, painted shut, that looked out not upon the street, but upon the neglected garden plot behind the house, running his fingers along its frame, its latch, the accumulated grime upon its sill, and making, at the very last, a small sound of satisfaction that he declined, despite my asking, to explain. It was the second matter, smaller, and at the time I thought it trivial, that seemed to occupy him far more deeply as we walked back across the street toward our own door. He had asked Reeves, almost as an afterthought, to describe the room exactly as it had been found on the night of Trevelyan's death, and Reeves, consulting his notebook once more, had mentioned, without any apparent sense of its significance, that the physician who examined the body, a Dr. Ainsworth, had made a small, curious remark in his report that no one had thought to question at the time. He had noted, in passing, that the study smelled faintly of lamp oil and smoke, as though a flame had been recently extinguished, despite the fact that the lantern on the desk, when found, was entirely cold, and had not, by the housekeeper's own testimony, been lit at all that evening. "I should like to speak with this Dr. Ainsworth myself," Holmes said, as we regained the pavement before our own door. "You think his report significant? I think, Watson, that a good physician records what he observes, and a mediocre one records only what he expects to find. If Dr. Ainsworth troubled himself to note a smell of smoke in a room with an unlit lamp, I begin to suspect he may be rather better than mediocre, and I find, on the whole, that I should like to hear, in his own words, precisely what else he noticed and thought unworthy of his official report." Holmes said nothing further about it that night, but I saw him take out his notebook before the fire and write a single line and underline it twice before he went to bed. I did not see what he had written until very much later. It read simply, "Someone was in that room, and someone left it burning." Number 7. Dr. Ainsworth's missing sentence. We called upon Dr. Ainsworth the following morning in his consulting rooms off Marylebone High Street, a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and the slightly harried air of a physician whose practice was larger than his patients. He remembered the case at once, and with rather more feeling than a routine death certificate might have led one to expect. "I have thought of that room more often than I should like to admit, Mr. Holmes," he said, once tea had been poured and the pleasantries dispensed with. There was nothing in Mr. Trevelyan's condition to contradict a diagnosis of heart failure. I want to be plain about that from the outset, for I would not have you think I signed a certificate I did not believe. A man of 61, found seated, no marks of violence, no sign of poison such as I was trained to look for. And yet, Holmes prompted, and yet I have never, in 15 years of practice, examined a death so quiet that troubled me quite so much afterward. It is difficult to explain to a layman, doctor, this with a nod to me, professional to professional. But there is a manner in which the body settles into death that a careful eye learns to read, much as your friend here reads a footprint or a cigar ash. Mr. Trevelyan's face held an expression I would ordinarily associate with a man interrupted mid-thought, not a man overtaken by pain. And there was, as I noted in my report, a distinct smell of oil smoke in that room, the smell of a wick recently extinguished, though the only lamp present was stone cold and had plainly not been lit that evening at all. Did you think to ask whether some other light source had recently been in that room? Ainsworth spread his ink-stained hands. I asked the housekeeper, certainly. She was quite certain no one had carried a lamp through that study, save Mr. Trevelyan himself, and he had used only the one upon his desk, which was cold as I found it. I confess I let the matter rest, Mr. Holmes, because I had no theory to hang it upon, and a physician who reports mysteries he cannot explain soon finds himself unwelcome at inquests. But I did not forget it. I have not forgotten it in a year. There is one further matter, Holmes said, leaning forward with the particular stillness that meant he had arrived, in his own mind, very near the heart of things. The color of the skin about the lips and beneath the fingernails. Did you note anything unusual there? Ainsworth's brow furrowed, and for a long moment he said nothing, casting his mind back with visible effort. A faint discoloration, he admitted at last, slowly, as though the memory surprised even himself in the recovering of it, slighter than one sees in ordinary heart failure. I attributed it, at the time, to the hour that had passed before the body was discovered. I did not think to attribute it to anything else. And might it be attributed, Holmes asked quietly, to a substance introduced into the body some hours before death, something slow-acting, difficult to detect after the fact, and calculated to produce, in its final effect, symptoms indistinguishable from a failing heart. Ainsworth went rather pale. "You are suggesting poison, Mr. Holmes." "I am suggesting, Doctor, that you were a more careful physician than the coroner's court gave you credit for being, and that your instincts a year ago were very much sounder than your evidence at the time allowed you to prove." We left Dr. Ainsworth considerably more shaken than we had found him, and considerably more useful to us than he yet understood himself to be, for he agreed, before we departed, to furnish Holmes with a full written account of every particular he could recall, an account that would, in time, prove a small but essential thread in the case Holmes was slowly, patiently weaving together. "You believe he was poisoned," I said, once we were back in the street. "I believe it is now the only theory that accounts for every fact we possess, Watson, and I have long held that when every fact points in a single direction, one does well to walk that direction, however unwelcome the view at the end of it may prove." We walked some while in silence after that, through streets busy now with the ordinary commerce of a London midday, costermongers calling their wares, a newspaper boy shouting some headline neither of us troubled to attend to, the general cheerful clamour of a city that knew nothing whatsoever of the quiet, patient reasoning unfolding within the mind of the tall, thin man walking beside me. I had grown accustomed, over our years of association, to these silences of Holmes's, the particular stillness that meant a case had shifted, in his own private estimation, from mere curiosity into something he considered himself genuinely obligated to solve. "You are troubled by something beyond the poison itself," I ventured, as we turned at last back toward Baker Street. "I am troubled, Watson, by the particular cruelty of a murder disguised so thoroughly as an ordinary death that not one soul, not the physician, not the coroner, not even the man's own beloved niece, whatever her private instincts told her, was permitted the ordinary comfort of open grief for a wrong openly acknowledged. Miss Trevelyan has spent a full year mourning a death the world insisted was natural, while some private, unshakable instinct told her otherwise, and no one troubled to take that instinct seriously enough to examine it. There is a particular loneliness in that, Watson, quite apart from the loneliness of grief itself, the loneliness of being disbelieved about the very shape of one's own sorrow. I find I have very little patience remaining for men who inflict that particular loneliness upon a grieving woman merely to protect their own comfortable position, and I intend, before this case concludes, to see that particular injustice as thoroughly undone as the murder itself. I had rarely heard Holmes speak with quite such open feeling about a client he had, at that point, not yet even met, and I understood, hearing it, that whatever cool and clinical reputation he cultivated for the world at large, the case of the Baker Street lantern had already begun to matter to him rather more personally than his usual professional interest generally allowed. Number 8. Miss Eleanor Trevelyan. It was 2 days later that we called upon Miss Trevelyan, at the modest but respectable lodgings she had taken in Bloomsbury following her uncle's death. She received us in a small parlour, neatly kept, with the particular bareness of rooms that have not yet become a home, as though she had furnished it only enough to live in, and no further. There were no photographs upon the mantel, no small ornaments of the kind that accumulate in a life lived comfortably. Only a single worn Bible, a sewing basket, and, propped in a modest frame upon a side table, the very watercolour I had seen upon the study wall at number 14, or its twin, the same young girl, the same garden, painted, I suspected, in duplicate, by an uncle who had wished to keep one copy for himself and give the other to the child who had sat for it. She was, I judged, perhaps 30 years of age, dark-haired, with an intelligent, watchful face that reminded me, oddly, of Mrs. Hudson's description of her uncle. She wore black still, though the year of formal mourning had technically passed, and there was about her the particular composure of a woman who has trained herself, through long practice, not to weep in front of strangers. "You've come about the lantern," she said, before Holmes had spoken a word. "Constable Reeves told me you'd taken an interest. I wondered when someone would. You knew of it then. Everyone on that street knows of it, Mr. Holmes. I simply choose not to go near enough to see it for myself." Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened almost imperceptibly. "I have not set foot in that house since the week after the funeral. I do not intend to. May I ask why?" She was silent for a long moment, and I saw Holmes wait, genuinely wait, without pressing her, in the manner he reserved for witnesses he judged too fragile to be hurried. "Because I do not believe my uncle died of a weak heart, Mr. Holmes," she said at last, quietly. "I have believed it for a year, and I have told no one, because I had not one shred of proof, and because everyone, the doctor, the police, my own solicitor, assured me I was simply a grieving girl looking for a shape to put to her grief. But I knew my uncle. He was 61 years old and strong as a dock worker still. He had never had a day's trouble with his heart in his life, and on the last evening I saw him, the very evening he died, he was not a frightened man, nor an ailing one. He was angry, Mr. Holmes, angrier than I had ever seen him. Angry with whom? Her eyes flicked, very briefly, toward the window, and I had the distinct sense that she was choosing her next words with great care. "With Mr. Ashworth, his solicitor. Number 9. The girl in the garden, I have promised you, more than once in the course of these accounts, that I would set down not merely the mechanics of a case, but something of its human weight. And I do not think I can properly tell you what followed without first telling you a little of who Eleanor Trevelyan was, and how she had come to be sitting in that bare Bloomsbury parlour, dressed still in a mourning she had not fully permitted herself to set aside. She had been born, by her own quiet account, in a small town in Kent, the only child of Josiah Trevelyan's younger sister, who had married, against her family's wishes, a schoolmaster of modest means and modest health, both of which had failed her within the same terrible winter when Eleanor was 15 years old. She had been left, quite suddenly, with no living relation in the world, save the uncle in London she had met, in all her life, perhaps twice. "I remember arriving at that house," she told us, her composure slipping, just slightly, for the first time since we had entered, and thinking it was the coldest, grandest, most frightening place I had ever seen. And I remember my uncle standing in the hall, this enormous man who smelled of pipe smoke and machine oil, looking at me as though he did not know what on earth to do with a 15-year-old girl in a black dress. And then he simply said, "Well, I suppose you had better see your room," and carried my one small trunk up the stairs himself, though he had a manservant perfectly capable of doing it. He had never, she said, been a demonstrative man. He did not speak easily of feeling, and I gathered, from the careful way she described him, that his affection had expressed itself less in words than in 1,000 small, deliberate acts. the watercolor he had painted of her in the garden, badly but earnestly, in an evening he might otherwise have spent at his ledgers. The way he had insisted, over the housekeeper's objections, that she be given proper schooling rather than simply trained for a suitable marriage. The fact that he had, without ever once mentioning it to her directly, altered his will within a year of her arrival to make her his sole heir, a fact she had learned only after his death. He was not an easy man to love, Mr. Holmes, she said. He was stubborn and private, and he trusted almost no one. I used to tease him that he trusted his ledgers more than he trusted people, and he never once denied it. But he loved me. I never doubted that, not for one single day of the 15 years I lived under his roof, and I do not intend to let anyone, not Mr. Ashworth, not the coroner, not the whole of Baker Street with its whispers about ghosts, tell me that his death was some ordinary, meaningless thing, when I know in my very bones that it was not. I confess that I found myself, by the end of this account, rather more moved than a physician of my years and experience generally allows himself to admit, and I saw, in the careful stillness of Holmes's own face, that he was not entirely unmoved either. But Holmes, ever mindful that grief and affection can obscure a witness's judgment quite as thoroughly as fear or malice, pressed her gently on a rather harder question before he permitted the conversation to move toward the events of that final evening. You have painted your uncle as a man of considerable tenderness, Miss Trevelyan, and I do not doubt a word of it. But I have also learned, in the course of my inquiries this past week, that he was accounted by many in his own trade a hard man to bargain with, a man who drove difficult wages, who dismissed at least one foreman without ceremony over a dispute of shillings, and who was not, by every account I have gathered, universally beloved along the wharves where his business was conducted. I ask you this not to wound you, but because I have found, in a long career, that the truest portrait of any man includes his hardness as faithfully as his tenderness, and a witness who paints only the gentleness risks leading an investigator away from facts that matter. You are quite right not to spare me it, Mr. Holmes, and I will not pretend to you that my uncle was a saint, for he most certainly was not. He was hard in his business, because he had clawed his way up from nothing, and he never entirely trusted that anyone given an easier road than his own would work half so hard along it. He dismissed men he believed lazy or dishonest without a second thought, and I do not doubt some of them nursed a grudge against him for years afterward. He was proud and stubborn and slow to forgive a slight, real or imagined. I loved him, Mr. Holmes, but I did not love him blindly, and I have spent a good part of this past year wrestling with the uncomfortable knowledge that a man capable of such tenderness toward one frightened orphan girl could also be, by all report, rather less tender toward men who depended upon him for their daily bread. And did that hardness ever turn toward you? She was quiet for a long moment. Once, she admitted at last. Some 3 years past, I had formed an attachment, foolish, I see now, and rather beneath the dignity, either of us, to a young clerk in his own employ, a Mr. Barrington, of good character but no fortune whatsoever, and my uncle, upon discovering it, forbade the match in terms I found, at the time, unforgivably cruel. He said I was worth a great deal more than a clerk's wages could ever provide me, and that he had not raised me out of a schoolmaster's poverty only to see me settle back into it by my own choosing. We did not speak properly, for the better part of 2 months. I have never fully told him, never had the chance to tell him, that I came, in time, to see the wisdom in what he had done, however brutally he had done it, for Mr. Barrington proved himself, within the year, to be rather less steady in character than I had believed him, and married elsewhere for money of his own before the year was out. I have always regretted, more than almost anything else in my life, that I let 2 months of coldness pass between us over a matter my uncle turned out, in the end, to have judged more clearly than I did myself. You carry that regret still. I carry a great many regrets, Mr. Holmes, as anyone does who has lost someone she loved before she had finished quarrelling with them properly. It is, I think, one of the crueler tricks grief plays upon us, that it does not wait politely until all our arguments are settled before it takes the person away. I saw Holmes absorb this with the particular gravity he reserved for facts that mattered rather more to the human shape of a case than to its mechanics. And I understood, watching him, that whatever cold reputation he cultivated for the benefit of my published accounts, he was listening to Eleanor Trevelyan that afternoon, not merely as a detective gathering evidence, but as a man genuinely moved by the weight of what she carried. "Tell me of that last evening," he said gently, "as precisely as you are able. Number 10, the last evening." She had dined with him, she said, at their usual hour, and had noticed at once that something weighed upon him. He ate little. He answered her small pleasantries with the distracted courtesy of a man whose mind was elsewhere entirely, and twice she caught him staring at nothing at all, his jaw set in the particular grim line she had learned, over 15 years, to associate with trouble in the business. "I asked him what was wrong," she said. "He would not tell me directly. That was his way, always, to protect me from whatever weighed on him until he had settled it himself. But he said, 'I have found something in the books that troubles me, Eleanor. Something I ought to have caught years ago, and did not, because I trusted a man I had no earthly business trusting so completely.' I asked him who he meant, and he would not say, not then. He only said that he had already sent for outside counsel, a man from Gray's Inn, whose name I did not know, and that he intended to have the matter settled properly, whatever it cost him. And after dinner, he went directly to his study and locked himself in with his ledgers, and did not come out again. I remember standing outside that door around 10 o'clock, thinking I might persuade him to rest, and hearing him moving about within, drawers opening, papers being sorted, that particular rustle of him working through his accounts that I had heard 1,000 evenings of my life. I did not disturb him. I wish, more than I can tell you, that I had. Did you see him light the lantern? I did not see it, but I smelled the oil smoke from beneath the door, as I always did on the evenings he worked late. It was as familiar to me as the smell of his pipe tobacco. I went to bed sometime after 11, believing he would follow when he was ready. He did not follow. The housekeeper found him the next morning, still seated in his chair, the fire long dead, the lantern cold beside him, though she swore to me, and I believed her, that she had smelled the same oil smoke in that room when she entered it, as though it had only just been extinguished. She stopped and pressed one gloved hand briefly to her eyes. I have carried that smell with me for a year, Mr. Holmes, the smell of a lamp that everyone insists was never lit. Holmes said nothing for a long moment. When at last he spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the clinical detachment he generally reserved for the gathering of facts. "You have carried it, Miss Trevelyan, because your instincts have been correct from the very first morning, and no one troubled themselves to listen. I intend to listen now. I believe I am beginning to understand who has been lighting your uncle's lantern and why, and I do not believe, when the truth is finally laid bare, that you will find it half so frightening as the silence you have been forced to live inside for the past 12 months. Number 11. The solicitor. We took our leave of Miss Trevelyan not long after, promising to return once we had made further progress. And it was in the cab back to Baker Street that Holmes first spoke to me at length of Cornelius Ashworth. A solicitor of 22 years' standing, Watson, with chambers off Bedford Row, and a reputation, among those who know the trade, for being scrupulously correct in every particular a client might trouble himself to examine, and rather less scrupulous, I begin to suspect, in the particulars a trusting client never thinks to examine at all. You know him already. I know of him. I made a point, while you were occupied with your patients this past week, of asking a few discreet questions among men who move in the same circles. He inherited the Trevelyan account from his own father, who had served old Josiah's business affairs for a decade before him. A relationship of trust built up over a generation, Watson, which is precisely the sort of relationship a clever and patient man might learn to exploit, a little at a time, over many years, confident that no one would think to look closely at figures that had never once, in 20 years, given anyone cause for suspicion. What emerged, in essence, from Eleanor's earlier account and from Holmes's own inquiries was this. Josiah Trevelyan's affairs had been managed for the better part of 20 years by Ashworth, a man Eleanor described as unfailingly courteous, unfailingly correct, and in some manner she could never quite articulate, unfailingly unsettling. In the final months of his life, Trevelyan had grown increasingly distant from Ashworth, cancelling appointments, muttering about having his own men look into the accounts, and, in the week before his death, summoning a second solicitor, entirely unknown to Ashworth, for a private and unexplained consultation that had lasted the better part of an afternoon. He had told no one, not even Eleanor, what that consultation concerned, but he had emerged from it, by her account, in an unusually grim humour, and had spent that final evening locked in his study, with his ledgers and his lantern, refusing supper, refusing company, working, as she put it, as though he were racing against something. He was found dead the following morning, before the second solicitor could be consulted again, before whatever business he had begun could be completed. His will, drawn up years earlier, and never, so far as anyone could determine, amended, left the whole of his estate, the house, the business, a considerable fortune, to Eleanor herself. Ashworth, as executor, had overseen its probate without incident. There had been no dispute, no contest, nothing whatsoever to suggest impropriety. You believe, I said, that your uncle discovered some wrongdoing on Mr. Ashworth's part, that he summoned outside counsel to investigate it, and that he died before he could act upon what he learned. I believe it is the shape that best fits every fact we possess, Watson, though I do not yet possess enough facts to call it proof, and there is a contradiction in this case that troubles me more than any other single detail, which is, if Ashworth murdered Trevelyan, and I grant you the shape of it is suggestive, a solicitor caught in some fraud, a client on the verge of exposing him, a death conveniently timed to prevent it, then why, in heaven's name, does the lantern continue to burn, night after night, drawing precisely the sort of attention a guilty man ought most to dread. A murderer wishes his crime forgotten, Watson, not haunted into fresh notoriety. Every servant on that street is now watching number 14. Every night that lamp burns, it invites precisely the scrutiny a wise criminal should most wish to avoid. It is, on its face, the single most foolish thing a guilty man could possibly do, and I have rarely known a clever criminal to behave with such reckless foolishness unless he had some more pressing reason that outweighed the risk entirely. Number 12. A call at Bedford Row. We called upon Ashworth himself 2 days later, under a pretext Holmes had devised with evident relish, that of a gentleman requiring counsel upon a small matter of inheritance, a Mr. Sigerson, recently returned from abroad, whose family solicitor had died and left certain affairs unsettled. I confess I found the deception uncomfortable, though I understood well enough its purpose. Holmes wished to observe the man before the man had any reason to suspect he was being observed. Ashworth's chambers were exactly what one would expect of a solicitor of 2 decades' standing. Dark wood panelling, shelves of calf-bound volumes, a faint smell of dust and sealing wax. Ashworth himself received us with a courtesy so smooth it seemed almost rehearsed. A tall man, perhaps 55, with silver at his temples and pale, watchful eyes that reminded me, uncomfortably, of Mrs. Hudson's description of Trevelyan's own, save that where the old man's watchfulness had seemed to Mrs. Hudson to hope for the best in people, Ashworth seemed, to my own eye at least, to be calculating precisely how much of the truth he could safely withhold. The interview itself was unremarkable. Holmes spun his fictional inheritance with the easy fluency of long practice, and Ashworth responded with the practiced sympathy of a man who has delivered the same reassurances to 100 anxious clients before. But I watched Holmes watching him, and I saw, in the small things Holmes remarked upon afterward, a portrait beginning to form that no amount of professional courtesy could entirely disguise. There was, too, a small matter of the office itself, that Holmes remarked upon only once we were safely away from Bedford Row, though I confess I had not, in the moment, thought it worth noticing at all. Did you observe the framed photograph upon his desk, Watson? The young man in cricketing whites, evidently some years out of date. His son, I supposed. His son, certainly, though observe how the frame stood angled not toward Ashworth's own accustomed chair, where a fond father might reasonably wish to look upon his boy's face while he worked, but toward the door, toward any visitor who might happen to glance that way upon entering. It is a small thing, Watson, and I would not build a case upon it alone. But a man who arranges his son's photograph for a visitor's benefit rather than his own private comfort is, I think, a man rather more concerned with the impression his devotion makes upon others than with the devotion itself, or else a man who can no longer bear to look upon that photograph directly and has turned it away from his own eyes for reasons he has not fully admitted even to himself. His hands, Holmes said, once we were back in the street. Did you notice his hands, Watson? I noticed they trembled very slightly when he poured the sherry. Not merely trembled in the particular manner of a man whose nerves have been strained for some considerable time, not merely by the ordinary anxieties of his profession, but by something sustained and private. And did you notice the state of his cuffs? His cuffs? Frayed, very slightly, at the left wrist, the sort of wear one acquires from repeated contact with rough stone or brick, of the kind one might find, for instance, in the narrow confines of an old coal chute. A solicitor of Ashworth's standing does not habitually crawl through such places in the course of his ordinary business, Watson. He does so only when some extraordinary business compels him to it, and only, I should think, under cover of darkness, when no one is watching to ask him why. Number 13. The Talk of a Sailor. I ought to record here, for the sake of an honest account, that our investigation did not proceed in so clean and unbroken a line as I have perhaps made it sound. There was, in those early weeks, a rival theory abroad, one that occupied a full 4 days of our attention before Holmes discarded it, and which I set down now, not because it led anywhere, but because it illustrates, I think, precisely the kind of patient sifting that a case such as this one demands. It began with Constable Reeves, who mentioned, almost in passing, that Trevelyan's business had once employed a foreman named Silas Grubb, a former sailor of violent temper, dismissed some 3 years before his employer's death for drunkenness and, it was rumoured, for striking a fellow workman nearly senseless in a dispute over wages. Grubb had been heard, on more than one occasion in the taverns of Wapping, cursing Trevelyan's name and swearing that the old skinflint would get what was coming to him. He had, moreover, spent some years at sea, and was said to be handy enough with locks and confined spaces to make short work of a coal chute or a garden wall. Holmes pursued this thread with his usual thoroughness. We spent the better part of 2 days tracing Grubb through the dockside taverns of the East End, and found him at last in a lodging-house off Cable Street, a broken, sodden creature of perhaps 50, whose violent temper appeared to have entirely exhausted itself in gin and self-pity long before we arrived. He admitted, readily enough, to hating Trevelyan, and to having wished him ill on more than one occasion, but when Holmes pressed him, gently, for even Holmes had little heart to press so pitiable a witness very hard, as to his whereabouts on the night of the old man's death, and on every night since that a lantern had been reported burning in the study window, his account proved so thoroughly and tediously corroborated by the landlord of his lodging-house, by 2 fellow lodgers, and by his own evident physical incapacity for the sort of nimble, careful trespass the case required, that Holmes abandoned the theory within the hour of our leaving him. A man who curses his enemy loudly in a public house, Watson, Holmes remarked, as we rode back toward Baker Street, is very rarely the man quietly working mischief in the dark. It is the silent grievance, not the shouted one, that one ought generally to fear. Grubb has wasted 3 days of our time and told us nothing whatsoever about number 14, save, perhaps, one small and useful thing, which is, that the whole of the East End believes Josiah Trevelyan to have been a hard and occasionally ruthless man in his business dealings, a reputation the neighbourhood of Baker Street, in its grief, has been rather too generous to forget. It is worth remembering, when a man is murdered, that he was very often not a saint in life, whatever kindness he showed his niece in private. It broadens, if nothing else, the field of those who might have wished him ill. I record this small failure honestly, for Holmes himself was always the first to insist that a detective's false starts belonged in the record every bit as much as his triumphs. For the public, he was fond of saying, imagines that I leap directly from mystery to solution, Watson, and it does neither my methods nor my reputation any good to let them go on believing it. Number 14. The Solicitor's Own Troubles. It was in the days following our fruitless pursuit of Silas Grubb that Holmes turned a portion of his attention away from number 14 itself and toward the private life of Cornelius Ashworth, a line of inquiry that yielded, I confess, rather more sympathy for the man than either of us had expected to feel before the case had run its course. A man does not embezzle £11,000 over 9 years for no reason at all, Watson, Holmes remarked, laying out upon our table a small collection of facts he had gathered through channels I did not always trouble to ask him to explain. Some men steal from simple greed, and I have met a great many of that unremarkable sort. But greed alone rarely sustains so patient and so disciplined a fraud across nearly a decade. There is generally, beneath it, some more particular pressure, a debt, a vice, an obligation the man dares not confess to anyone who might otherwise help him honestly discharge it. What Holmes uncovered, through a discreet conversation with a clerk at Ashworth's own bank, and a rather less discreet conversation with a bookmaker of dubious reputation off the Strand, painted a portrait of a man whose outward correctness concealed a private ruin some years in the making. Ashworth, it transpired, had married young and unhappily to a woman who had died some 12 years past, leaving him with a son now grown to manhood. A son who had, by all accounts, inherited none of his father's outward discipline, and who had run up gaming debts of a magnitude that had, on at least 3 occasions Holmes was able to trace, required his father's quiet and increasingly desperate intervention to prevent public disgrace, and worse. The boy is presently abroad, I am told, in circumstances his father has gone to considerable lengths to obscure, even from his own professional acquaintance, Holmes said. I do not offer this as an excuse for what Ashworth has done, Watson, for a father's love, however genuine, does not entitle a solicitor to plunder a trusting client's accounts, nor certainly to end that client's life to conceal it. But I offer it because I have found, in a long career of studying the men who commit such crimes, that very few of them set out, at the beginning, believing themselves capable of murder. They begin, almost always, with some smaller and more forgivable-seeming compromise. A debt covered here, an accounting adjusted there, always with the private intention of repaying it before anyone notices. And the true tragedy of such men is not that they are monsters from the first, but that each small compromise makes the next slightly easier to justify, until the distance between the man they once believed themselves to be and the man capable of murder has been crossed so gradually that they scarcely notice the crossing until it is far behind them. I found myself, hearing this, rather less inclined to simple hatred of the man we pursued, and rather more troubled by the quiet, ordinary manner in which decent beginnings can curdle, given years enough and pressure enough, into something monstrous. I said as much to Holmes, and he nodded slowly. It is, I think, the single most valuable lesson this profession has taught me, Watson, and I do not believe I shall ever tire of relearning it. The villain of any true case is very rarely so different, at the outset, from the rest of us as the sensational papers would have their readers believe. It is only the accumulation of small, private, comfortable lies, each one easier to tell than the last, that carries an ordinary man, step by step, to a place none of us would ever willingly choose to stand, if we could see the whole distance clearly from where we first began walking. Number 15. A visit, uninvited. It was against this backdrop of growing sympathy that did not, I should note, in any way soften Holmes's determination to see the man caught, that Ashworth made his boldest and, in hindsight, his most foolish move of the entire affair. He called upon Eleanor Trevelyan himself, some 4 days after the threatening note, under the perfectly respectable pretext of discussing certain routine matters of the estate that remained, technically, within his authority as executor to conclude. Eleanor, unnerved but resolved not to betray her suspicion, received him, at Holmes's own urging, delivered by hasty note that morning, that she do exactly this and report every particular of the conversation to us the moment it concluded. He was, in every outward respect, precisely the same courteous gentleman he had always been, she told us that evening, her composure rather more brittle than her words let on. He inquired after my health, expressed his continuing sorrow at my uncle's passing, and then, with the smoothest possible transition, suggested that I might find it a considerable relief to be rid of the house at number 14 entirely, that he knew of a buyer, a discreet and generous buyer, who would take it off my hands at a price rather better than the open market was likely to offer, sparing me the burden of a property that had, as he delicately put it, acquired an unfortunate local reputation through no fault of your own. Did he mention the lantern directly? Holmes asked. Only once, and only obliquely. He said he had heard the unfortunate talk among the neighbours, and that he thought it a great pity a grieving young woman should be made to suffer such foolish gossip on top of her genuine loss. He was very careful, Mr. Holmes. If I had not already suspected him of everything you now believe him guilty of, I do not think I would have found a single word of it alarming. And yet, you found it alarming regardless. His eyes did not match his voice, Eleanor said simply. His voice was all sympathy and gentle concern. His eyes, the whole time he spoke, kept moving toward the window, toward number 14 itself, visible from my own parlour at a certain angle, as though he could not quite help himself, as though the house pulled at his attention, even while his mouth performed kindness. I have watched a great many men perform kindness they did not feel, Mr. Holmes, in the year since my uncle died, when everyone believed they owed the grieving orphan a certain quantity of comfortable sympathy, whether they felt it or not. I have grown rather practiced at telling the difference. Mr. Ashworth's kindness was a performance from the very first word to the last, and I do not believe, watching those restless eyes, that it was grief for my uncle that troubled him at all. Holmes was visibly pleased by this account, though he took care to temper his satisfaction with a genuine concern for what it revealed. He is growing bolder, Watson, precisely because our public retreat has convinced him the danger has passed, exactly as I hoped it might. But boldness in a desperate man cuts 2 ways. It may bring him back to that house sooner than I had dared to hope. It may also, I fear, tempt him towards some more direct threat against Miss Trevelyan herself, should his search continue to fail him. I think it prudent, from this evening forward, that she is not left entirely without protection. It was arranged, discreetly and at Holmes's own expense, that a retired police sergeant of Lestrade's acquaintance, a broad, unassuming man named Colby, who possessed the invaluable gift of looking entirely unremarkable while missing absolutely nothing, should take rooms in the house directly opposite Eleanor's own lodgings, ostensibly as an ordinary lodger, and keep a quiet, watchful eye upon her comings and goings until the matter had reached its conclusion. Eleanor, when informed of this arrangement, received it with the particular gratitude of a woman who has spent a year believing herself entirely alone in her fears, and finding, at last, that she was not. Number 16. A question of motive. I record here a conversation Holmes and I had, some evenings later, that I believe illuminates something essential about the peculiar patience the case demanded of us both. For I confess that by this point in the investigation, some 3 weeks into our public pretense of disinterest, my own nerves had begun to fray rather more than I liked to admit. I do not understand, Holmes, why we do not simply confront him now, with what we already know. The fraud alone would see him ruined, if not imprisoned. Must we truly wait for him to return to that house a final time, and risk whatever mischief he might work upon Miss Trevelyan in the meanwhile? Holmes set down his violin, for he had taken, in those quiet weeks, to playing rather more than his usual habit, a low, contemplative sort of music that I had come to associate with periods of deep private thought, and regarded me with the particular patience he reserved for questions he judged worth answering fully rather than dismissing. Consider what we could presently prove, Watson, were we to confront him tonight. We could demonstrate the fraud, certainly, through Whitfield's testimony and the ledgers Trevelyan himself examined. Sufficient, I grant you, to ruin the man professionally, and very possibly to see him imprisoned for theft. But theft alone does not hang a man, Watson, and I am not content to see Cornelius Ashworth face a comfortable few years in prison for embezzlement, when I believe, with every fibre of my reasoning, that he murdered the very man whose trust he betrayed. Dr. Ainsworth's suspicion of poison remains, at present, precisely that, a suspicion unsupported by any chemical proof, for the body was buried a year ago, and exhumation, even were the courts inclined to grant it after so long a passage of time, would very likely yield nothing conclusive after 12 months in the earth. If I confront him tonight, on the strength of the fraud alone, he will very likely confess to the theft. A clever solicitor's calculation, Watson, sacrificing the lesser crime to protect himself entirely from the greater one, and the murder of Josiah Trevelyan will go forever unpunished, its truth buried, as completely as the man himself. And you believe he will confess the murder, given time enough? I believe a guilty man permitted to think himself safe, and pressed by circumstance into one final desperate act, reveals a great deal more of himself than a guilty man cornered too early and given leisure to construct his defense. I mean to catch him in the very act of searching for evidence he ought never to have needed to search for, were his conscience truly clear. For what innocent man breaks into a dead client's house, night after night, for a full year? That act alone, Watson, speaks more eloquently of guilt than any confession extracted under threat of the noose. And I believe, once cornered in the very room where his crime was committed, with no possibility of retreat and no time to construct a comfortable lie, he will tell us considerably more than his own solicitor would ever advise him to tell a court. I have seen it happen 100 times before. A guilty man who believes himself safe will very often talk simply because the silence has become, at last, unbearable to carry alone. Number 17. A night that came to nothing. We returned our attention to Ashworth, and it was not long after that our theory received a kind of confirmation neither of us had anticipated. 2 mornings later, a note arrived at Eleanor Trevelyan's lodgings, unsigned, delivered by hand in the night. She brought it to us herself, white-faced, her composure so carefully maintained in our first meeting, now visibly shaken. The note, which I have kept among my papers to this day, read as follows: Miss Trevelyan, you would do well to sell the house at number 14 without further delay, and to cease encouraging the attentions of Mr. Holmes and his associates in a matter that does not concern them. Some things are better left where the dead have put them. I will not warn you a second time. You see, she said, her voice unsteady, I told you I was not imagining this. Holmes examined the note with his lens for some minutes. The paper, unremarkable and available at any stationer in London. The hand, disguised, but with a certain looping quality to the letter T that he remarked upon and folded carefully into his notebook. The ink, ordinary, dried perhaps 6 hours before delivery, judging by its settled colour. This is a threat, born of fear, not confidence, he said at last. A confident man does not warn his victims, he simply removes them. Whoever wrote this is frightened, Miss Trevelyan, and a frightened man is far more likely to make a mistake than a calm one. But her fright, once seeded, did not remain contained to that single note. 3 nights later, her own landlady, a Mrs. Pargeter, a stout and sensible widow with no patience whatsoever for nonsense, reported hearing footsteps upon the fire escape outside Eleanor's window sometime after midnight, and finding, the following morning, that the small side gate to the mews had been forced, though nothing within the house itself appeared disturbed. Eleanor herself had heard nothing, having taken, at Holmes's earlier suggestion, to sleeping with her door bolted and a lamp burning through the night. A small irony, I remarked to Holmes afterward, that she should find herself keeping her own vigil of light against the dark, much as some unknown hand kept vigil across the street at number 14. He is testing whether she frightens easily, Holmes said grimly, once we had examined the forced gate ourselves and found, as he had half expected, the same faint traces of reddish garden clay upon its latch that he had once tracked home upon his own boots. And I begin to think, Watson, that our Mr. Ashworth is a rather more desperate man than his composed exterior would suggest. A desperate man is a dangerous one. I would ask you to do exactly the opposite of what this note suggests, Miss Trevelyan. Do not sell the house, do not leave London, and tell no one, not Ashworth, not your friends, not even your own maid, that you received it, nor that your gate was forced. And what will you do? Holmes rose, and there was, in the set of his shoulders, something of the hunting hound catching its first true scent of the day. I believe, Miss Trevelyan, that it is time Scotland Yard announced, publicly and with some regret, that the strange business of the lantern at number 14 has been investigated thoroughly, found to be nothing more than the mischief of local boys, and considered closed. Number 18. The false retreat. I confess, I did not understand Holmes's strategy fully until he explained it to me that evening, over a pipe and a fire that had burned rather lower than either of us noticed, nor until I had watched him put it into motion the following morning at Scotland Yard itself. Lestrade received us in his cramped little office with the particular resigned good humour of a man who has learned, over many years, that Sherlock Holmes rarely calls upon him without asking for something both irregular and, in the end, entirely worth granting. You want me to tell the newspapers the case is closed, Lestrade said flatly, once Holmes had laid out his request. When it isn't. I want you to tell the newspapers precisely what I ask you to tell them, Lestrade. and to trust that I have not yet, in 20 years of our acquaintance, led you toward an empty conclusion. And if this Ashworth fellow of yours is innocent, and I've gone and told half of Fleet Street that Scotland Yard chased a ghost story for a month over nothing, then you shall have the small satisfaction of having been entirely correct in your original skepticism, and I shall owe you a rather better dinner than the one you are currently imagining me buying you as thanks." Holmes's tone softened, just slightly. "I do not ask this lightly, Lestrade. A young woman's safety, and very possibly a murderer's conviction, depend upon our friend believing himself entirely unwatched. Give me 3 weeks of your public disinterest, and I believe I can deliver you rather more than a ghost story in return." Lestrade grumbled, as he always grumbled, and agreed, as he always agreed, and within 2 days a small item had appeared in one of the lesser evening papers, buried well past the front page, exactly as Holmes had specified, noting that the curious matter of the illuminated window at Baker Street, which had for some weeks excited the imagination of the local populace, has been determined by police investigation to be the work of mischievous local boys, and the case is now considered closed. "Whoever is entering that house," Holmes explained to me that evening, "has not yet found what he is searching for. We know this because he continues to return at considerable personal risk, night after night. He is also, by the evidence of that note and the forced gate, growing afraid. Afraid enough to threaten a grieving young woman in the hope of frightening off an investigation he cannot otherwise control. A frightened man who has not yet succeeded will do one of 2 things, Watson. He will abandon his search entirely, in which case we shall likely never catch him, and Miss Trevelyan will live the rest of her days beneath an unanswered question, or he will conclude that the danger has passed and make one final, careless attempt to finish what he began. I mean to convince him of the latter. He was, I should add, seen about London on other business in the days that followed, with every appearance of a man whose mind had moved entirely elsewhere, dining at his club, taking up the Kensington blackmail with renewed public enthusiasm, even permitting himself, on one occasion, to be quoted by a journalist of his acquaintance dismissing the alleged phenomena at Baker Street as the overactive imagination of an otherwise sensible neighborhood. I confess, I found myself, more than once in those days, genuinely uncertain whether his indifference was performance or plain truth. So complete was the disguise he wore. Number 19. 3 quiet weeks. I will not pretend that the weeks which followed were filled with the kind of incident that makes for gripping narration. They were not. They were, in fact, remarkably quiet, and it was precisely that quiet, I came to understand, that made them so difficult to endure. Constable Reeves was reassigned to other duties. The lantern, so far as the newspapers were concerned, ceased to exist, and yet it continued to burn. Mrs. Hudson reported it 3 times more during those 3 weeks, always at 11, always extinguished before dawn, always in a house that showed, upon the following day's discreet inspection, not one single mark of entry through any door or window. Holmes himself, I later learned, had arranged for the study's cold hearth to be dusted each morning with a thin, invisible film of powdered chalk of his own devising, undetectable to the eye, but certain to record the faintest footprint of anyone who crossed it. And each morning, without fail, he examined it, and each morning, for 3 long weeks, he found it unmarked. I asked him, on one particularly restless evening, How a man could possibly enter and leave a house so thoroughly sealed, night after night, without leaving any trace whatsoever, when we ourselves had confirmed every door and window bolted from within. That, said Holmes, is the second great question this case has asked of us, and I confess I did not have its full answer until I made a rather unglamorous discovery in the garden behind number 16, the empty house standing next door, which has been unlet for the better part of 2 years, and whose cellars, I have since confirmed, were connected to those of number 14 by a passage built, I should imagine, in the days when smugglers' goods moved more freely along this stretch of London than the law strictly permitted. Old houses keep old secrets, Watson, quite as faithfully as old men do. You've known this for some time. I have suspected it since our very first visit, when Constable Reeves assured me the cellars were as thoroughly sealed as the rooms above, and I noted that his confidence rather outpaced his actual examination of them. I confirmed it myself, quietly, while you believed me occupied with the Kensington affair. I asked him too whether he did not fear that our friend, whoever he proved to be, might simply abandon his search altogether, now that so many weeks had passed without incident. I confess the possibility troubles me daily, Watson, he admitted, with a candour he rarely permitted himself. But I have staked a great deal of this investigation upon my reading of the man's character, and a man does not send threatening notes to a grieving young woman, nor force a garden gate at midnight, unless the thing he seeks matters to him a very great deal indeed. Matters, I should think, considerably more than his own safety. Such men do not surrender easily. Patience, Watson. I do not believe that night is far off. Number 20. A night that came to nothing. He was very nearly proven wrong, or so it seemed to us both, on a particular Tuesday evening, some 2 weeks into our vigil, when every sign appeared to indicate that our quarry would return at last. Holmes had received word, through a discreet contact at Ashworth's own chambers, that the solicitor had cancelled 2 appointments that afternoon and been seen leaving Bedford Row in evident agitation shortly after 4 o'clock. Holmes was convinced, as convinced, I think, as I ever saw him, that the night would bring our answer, and we took up our position in the small anteroom adjoining the study of number 14, a full 2 hours before the appointed time, the borrowed key from Reeves cold in Holmes's pocket, a police whistle and signal cord arranged exactly as they would be arranged again, more successfully, some days later. We waited through the striking of 11. We waited through midnight and past it into the small, aching hours of the early morning, when the cold seeps up through even the soundest boots, and the mind begins to conjure movement in every shifting shadow. Nothing came. No footsteps sounded in the cellar passage below us. No match was struck. The lantern upon the desk remained cold and dark until we abandoned our post, chilled through and disheartened, somewhere past 3 in the morning, and let ourselves out again through the mews as quietly as we had entered. I will confess that I found that failed vigil more discouraging than almost any other moment in the case, and I said as much to Holmes as we walked home through streets gone silent and blue with the coming dawn. You are disappointed, Watson, and I do not blame you for it. But consider what we have actually learned tonight, rather than what we failed to observe. We have learned that our friend does not come simply because opportunity presents itself. He came, or did not come, according to some calculation of his own that we have not yet fully understood. He is more cautious than I had credited him, or else something occurred this afternoon to unsettle his nerve rather than embolden it. Either way, it tells us something true about the man we are hunting, and a detective who learns something true, even from a night that yields no arrest, has not wasted his evening. I found this rather cold comfort at the time, chilled as I was to the bone, but I have come, in the years since, to understand it as one of the truer things Holmes ever said to me about the patient, unglamorous heart of his profession, that a case is very rarely won in a single dramatic night, but built, instead, from a great many quiet and disappointing ones, each teaching some small fragment of the truth that the final night alone is left to assemble. Number 21. Mr. Whitfield of Gray's Inn. It was in the days following that disappointing vigil that Holmes turned his full attention to the second solicitor, the mysterious Mr. Whitfield whom Trevelyan had summoned in the final week of his life, and whose identity had eluded us for the better part of a month, until Holmes traced him at last through the careful examination of a cab company's fare records, a diary kept by Trevelyan's dismissed housekeeper, and a good deal of the patient, unglamorous legwork that never finds its way into the more dramatic tellings of a case. Whitfield's chambers, when we found them, proved a good deal less grand than Ashworth's, a cramped set of rooms up 3 flights of stairs off Gray's Inn, cluttered with the particular disorder of a solicitor who trusts his memory rather more than his filing system. He was a thin, elderly man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, and he received us with a caution that gradually, as Holmes's questions proved themselves both informed and sympathetic, warmed into something closer to relief. The relief, I think, of a man who has carried a professional secret alone for a year and is glad, at last, to be permitted to share its weight. I wondered if anyone would ever come, he said, once tea had been arranged and the door firmly closed. Mr. Trevelyan swore me to a most particular silence, Mr. Holmes, and I am a man who honours his instructions to the letter, whatever it costs me in a sleepless night or two. But I confess I have wondered this past year whether I ought not to have come forward myself, once his death was reported, and no summons ever came from any quarter asking me what I knew. Tell me, if you would, precisely what he asked of you, and in what order the facts presented themselves to your own mind as you examined his accounts. Whitfield settled back, removed his spectacles, and polished them with the slow deliberation of a man organizing his thoughts. He came to me on a Tuesday, unannounced, carrying a leather case of ledgers under his own arm, trusted no clerk, no messenger, carried them himself through the London streets, like a man guarding the crown jewels. He told me he suspected fraud in his own accounts, going back, he believed, some 8 or 9 years, and that he wished an independent examination, as he no longer trusted the solicitor who had managed those very accounts throughout the whole of the period in question. He did not, at that first meeting, name Mr. Ashworth directly. He was, I think, still hoping, against his own evident suspicion, that his instinct would prove mistaken. And your examination took the better part of 3 days, working through the nights, for he impressed upon me a most peculiar urgency, an urgency I did not, at the time, fully understand, though I understand it a great deal better now, knowing what I know of the manner of his death. I found the fraud within the first day, Mr. Holmes, and I want to be plain that it was not a clumsy fraud. It was patient, and it was clever, and it was built, brick by brick, over the better part of a decade. Small discrepancies in the shipping accounts, a percentage here, a rounding error there, none of it large enough on its own to draw the eye of a busy man who trusted his solicitor absolutely, but accumulating, over 9 years, to a sum I calculated, conservatively, at somewhere in excess of £11,000. I confess the figure startled me, a fortune by any ordinary measure, and motive enough, I thought grimly, for a good deal worse than what had already occurred. I presented my findings to Mr. Trevelyan on the Thursday evening, Whitfield continued. He received them with a calm I found, at the time, rather admirable, and rather more unsettling in hindsight. He said he intended to confront the man responsible directly, and to give him one chance only, to make restitution privately, before he involved the authorities. I urged him against it, Mr. Holmes. I told him plainly that a man capable of so patient and so calculated a deception was not a man to be trusted with advance warning of his own exposure. He would not be dissuaded. He said, and I remember his words precisely, for they have stayed with me this whole year past, I have trusted this man for 20 years, Whitfield, and I owe it to whatever remains of that trust to look him in the eye before I destroy him. Reasoning, Watson, Holmes murmured beside me, and I understood he was thinking aloud, working through the sequence as Whitfield laid it before us. Trevelyan discovers the fraud. He seeks independent confirmation, which he receives. He resolves, against sound advice, to confront the guilty party directly, rather than proceeding first to the police. That confrontation, or the anticipation of it, provides Ashworth both motive and opportunity, but it does not yet explain the lantern, nor the documents, nor why a careful man like Trevelyan, having been warned so plainly of the danger, took no precaution whatsoever to protect himself. But he did take a precaution, Mr. Holmes, Whitfield said quietly. It is the very reason I have been waiting, this whole year, for someone to come and ask me these questions. Number 22. The second lantern Whitfield rose, crossed to a locked cabinet in the corner of his cramped office, and produced from it a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle, which he set upon the table between us, with the particular care of a man handling something he has guarded jealously for far too long. He came to me a second time, 3 days after our first meeting, the same week, I believe, that he died. He told me he had decided against confronting his solicitor without protection, and that he had prepared something to ensure that, whatever happened to him personally, the truth could not simply be buried along with the body. He was a man who understood something of mechanisms, Mr. Holmes. He had, after all, built his fortune on devices meant to be trusted absolutely, even in a storm, even in the dark. He told me he had built a second lantern, identical in every outward respect to the one that stood upon his study desk, save for a false flaw of his own construction beneath the oil reservoir, and that he had, within that hidden compartment, placed my full written report, together with his own account of the fraud, in his own hand, and a new codicil to his will, drawn up and witnessed, disinheriting his solicitor from the executorship and directing that the whole of the evidence be delivered into his niece's hands, should anything untoward befall him, exactly 1 year from the date of his death. Long enough, he said, for any guilty conscience to reveal itself under its own weight, without his niece ever needing to know the danger he had placed himself in to protect her. He unwrapped the bundle with careful, reverent hands, and there, resting upon the table before us, sat a lantern I recognized at once. Solid brass, ship-built, its glass panes polished, and engraved insignia upon its base, identical, in every particular I could discern, to the one still resting cold and undisturbed upon the desk at number 14. He asked only one thing of me beyond my silence, Whitfield said, that I deliver this into Miss Trevelyan's hands myself, exactly 1 year from the date of his death, and that I tell no living soul of its existence before that day arrived, not the police, not the courts, not even her, until the appointed hour. I have kept that instruction faithfully, Mr. Holmes, though I confess it has weighed upon my conscience a great deal more heavily than I anticipated when I first agreed to it. Holmes lifted the lantern with the same careful reverence Whitfield had shown it, turning it slowly in his long fingers, and I saw, in his face, the particular stillness of a man who has just watched the final and most essential piece of a long puzzle settle, at last, into its rightful place. You have kept faith with a dead man's final wish, Mr. Whitfield, and I do not believe you need trouble your conscience over it a moment longer. The year Mr. Trevelyan asked of you has very nearly run its course. I believe the time has come to deliver this lantern precisely as he instructed, and I believe, moreover, that its delivery will provide the final thread I need to close this case for good. And the lamp across the street? I asked. The one that burns each night in the study? Holmes set the true lantern down with great care, and something almost like a smile crossed his features. The particular satisfaction of a man who has, at long last, understood a mystery in its entirety. Is precisely what it has always been, Watson, an empty vessel, holding no secret whatsoever, being searched night after night by a desperate man who does not yet know he is hunting a decoy. Mr. Whitfield's careful silence and Mr. Trevelyan's own quiet cunning have kept the true evidence safe in this very cabinet for the whole of the past year, while our Mr. Ashworth has worn a year's worth of nerves thin, searching an object that was never anything more than what it appears to be. I confess I laughed aloud at the sheer, quiet cleverness of it. An old man, dying, perhaps, with the full knowledge of what awaited him, and yet finding, in his final days, the composure to build one honest trap and set it patiently ticking, certain that whatever guilt lived in his murderer's conscience would, given time enough, betray itself far more thoroughly than any accusation Trevelyan could have made while he still drew breath. 19b. A Craftsman's Final Work. We remained some while longer with Mr. Whitfield, for Holmes was eager to understand not merely the fact of the second lantern's existence, but the particular manner of its construction, a detail that seemed, to my own eye, a small technical curiosity, but which Holmes pursued with the thoroughness he reserved for anything that touched upon a case's central mechanism. "Did Mr. Trevelyan tell you how he came to build it?" Holmes asked. "A false floor beneath an oil reservoir is no simple matter of a hidden drawer, Mr. Whitfield. It requires a craftsman's precision, particularly if the lamp is to remain, in every outward respect, functional and indistinguishable from its twin. He told me a good deal about it, in fact, for I think the telling gave him some private comfort in what must have been a very frightening week for him, whatever composure he showed the world." Whitfield settled back, his spectacles catching the last of the afternoon light through his cluttered window. He said he had built the original lantern, the one now standing upon his study desk, some 30 years before, as a young man newly arrived in London, determined to prove to the established trade that a Bristol dockhand's son could outcraft any workshop in the city. He kept it always upon his own desk, he said, as a reminder of how far he had come, and he had grown, over 30 years, rather sentimental about it, in the particular manner old men grow sentimental about the small objects that marked their youth. When he determined to build the second lantern, he told me he insisted on doing every part of the work himself, in the small workshop he still maintained behind his business premises, rather than trusting the task to any of his own craftsmen, not merely for secrecy's sake, though that was certainly part of it, but because he wished, in his own words, to build one more honest thing with my own 2 hands before I am done, whatever else this old body still has waiting for it. He worked on it, by his own account to me, across 4 long evenings, fitting the false floor with a precision that took, he said, rather longer than he had anticipated, for he was determined that no casual inspection, and, I suspect, no desperate and repeated inspection either, should ever discover the seam by touch or by eye alone. He built it, Mr. Holmes, to be trusted absolutely, exactly as every lantern he had ever built in his life had been built to be trusted, whatever storm or darkness a sailor might carry it through. Holmes turned the true lantern over once more in his hands, tracing the nearly invisible seam along its base with something that looked, in that moment, very much like genuine admiration. It is, I think, the finest piece of craftsmanship I have encountered in a case in some years, Mr. Whitfield, and I do not say that lightly. A man who could build so perfect a deception, entirely undetectable to a solicitor searching for precisely such a deception across a full 12 months, possessed a mind as sharp and as patient as any I have had the pleasure of matching wits against, save that he built this particular puzzle not to defeat an investigator, but to protect a niece he would not live to see grown fully into the woman she has since become. He asked me once, Whitfield added quietly, whether I thought it a foolish thing, an old man spending his last free evenings building a trick lantern rather than simply going to the police with what he knew. I told him I thought it entirely his own affair, and none of my business to judge. But I will tell you now, Mr. Holmes, what I did not have the courage to tell him then, that I thought it the wisest thing I had seen a frightened man do in the whole of my career, for the police, however well-intentioned, might easily have moved too slowly or too clumsily and driven a desperate man to destroy the evidence, or flee, or worse, before any formal case could be properly built. Mr. Trevelyan trusted patience, Mr. Holmes, and craftsmanship, and the slow unfolding of time, rather more than he trusted any swift or dramatic gesture. I believe, watching how thoroughly his trust has been rewarded, that he judged the matter rather better than I gave him credit for at the time. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, still turning the lantern slowly in the fading afternoon light. I believe he judged it exactly as well as any man could have judged it, Mr. Whitfield, facing the particular darkness he found himself facing. It is, I think, the finest compliment I have ever paid a client I never had the honour of meeting while he lived. 19c. Lestrade's final arrangements. Holmes moved quickly, once Whitfield's account had confirmed what he had long suspected, and it was in Lestrade's cramped Scotland Yard office, 2 mornings after our visit to Gray's Inn, that the final shape of the trap was settled between them. "You're asking a great deal, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, though I noted he said it with rather less of his customary skepticism than he had shown at their first conversation some weeks before. Constables stationed at a passage from an empty house next door, on the strength of a theory about a lantern and a solicitor's frayed cuffs. "I am asking, Lestrade, for the modest deployment of 2 constables on a single night, in exchange for which I believe I can deliver you the solved murder of a respectable city tradesman, a conviction for embezzlement running into 5 figures, and the sort of newspaper notice that has done neither of our reputations any particular harm in the past. I do not believe I am asking a great deal at all, when you consider what stands to be gained." Lestrade permitted himself a thin smile. "You've a gift for making a favor sound like an investment. I'll say that for you. Very well. 2 men at the mouth of that passage, and myself besides, waiting in the street with a signal ready. But I'll want it understood plainly, Holmes. If this Ashworth doesn't come, or if he comes and gives us nothing more than an awkward explanation for an evening stroll through a dead man's cellar, I'll not be made a fool of twice over the same ghost story. You have my word, Lestrade, that if he does not come tonight, I shall trouble you for 1 further night, and 1 further only, and if that too yields nothing, I shall withdraw the theory entirely, and trouble you no more with number 14. Holmes's tone carried a confidence, I confess, I did not entirely share, given the disappointment of our previous vigil. But I do not believe it will come to that. Every fact I have gathered these past 6 weeks points toward tonight, or a night very shortly following it, and I have learned to trust the accumulated weight of many small facts rather more than I trust my own occasional impatience for a swifter conclusion. Lestrade grunted, in the particular manner that constituted, from him, a genuine expression of confidence, and set about the practical business of arranging his men, quiet, unremarkable fellows in plain clothes rather than uniform, positioned with instructions to remain utterly still and utterly silent until the signal came, and to take no action whatsoever, however long the wait, until Holmes's own bell sounded from within the house. "One further matter," Holmes added, as we rose to leave. "I should like Dr. Ainsworth informed and available, should we require his professional testimony as to the physical evidence immediately, without the delay of summoning him fresh, once the arrest is made. A confession extracted in the heat of a genuine confrontation carries a very different weight than one recited coldly, days later, before a magistrate, Lestrade, and I intend to have every possible advantage secured before we ever set foot in that house tonight. 20x. The watch begins. Holmes moved quickly once Whitfield's account confirmed what he had long suspected. Within 2 days, Lestrade had arranged, at Holmes's request, for the number 14 probate matter to be formally and publicly settled, the house transferred fully into Miss Trevelyan's name, all outstanding business concluded, the news of it printed, quietly but unmistakably, in the property notices of 2 of the better London papers, exactly where a careful solicitor, still watching the case with anxious eyes, could not fail to see it. If our friend has not found what he seeks by the night that notice appears, Holmes told me, he shall have lost his last opportunity to find it undisturbed. A man in his position, I think, does not surrender such a chance quietly, not after a year of searching, and not with the noose of a legal settlement drawing closed around whatever excuse he might once have invented for entering that house again. It came, in the end, on a Tuesday, a raw, wet night in early December, with a fog so thick it seemed to swallow the gas lamps whole, leaving only faint blurred halos to mark their positions along the street. Holmes woke me himself, just past 10, already dressed in dark clothing, a look upon his face I had learned to associate with the final act of a case. "He'll come tonight, Watson. I am certain of it. You want me to come with you. I want you armed, and I want you silent, and I want you exactly where I tell you to stand, and not 1 inch further. Can I rely upon you for all 3? I told him he could, and within the half hour we had crossed the street under cover of the fog and let ourselves, by a key Holmes had somehow acquired from Reeves, in through the servants' entrance at the rear of number 14. We took up position in the small anteroom adjoining the study, the same narrow space, thick with dust, from which a gap in the door's old hinges afforded a clear view of the desk and the lantern upon it, where we had kept our fruitless vigil once before. Holmes had, I noted, already made his own careful arrangements. A length of dark cord run along the skirting board to a bell he had hidden in the front hall, connected, he murmured, to nothing more sinister than a signal for Lestrade's men waiting quietly in the street beyond. Together with 2 uniformed constables, he had, this time, stationed discreetly at the mouth of the passage from number 16 itself, that our quarry might find no route of retreat once discovered. We settled in to wait. I have sat through a great many silent vigils in my years beside Sherlock Holmes, but I do not recall one that pressed upon the nerves quite so heavily as that one did, heavier even than the fruitless night that had preceded it. For this time, every fact we possessed insisted that something must happen, and the not knowing of precisely when pressed upon the mind with a weight the earlier disappointment had, at least, taught me to endure. The house was utterly still. Somewhere above us, a board settled with the small, sharp crack that old houses make in the cold, and I felt my heart leap absurdly at the sound. The fog pressed against the windows like something with a face, and Holmes, beside me, remained utterly motionless, his eyes fixed upon the study door, his breathing so shallow and so even that I might have believed him asleep had I not known him better. 11 o'clock came and went, and nothing happened. 20 minutes past the hour, I heard it, the faintest possible sound from somewhere beneath us. Not a footstep, something softer, a scrape, perhaps, of stone against stone. Holmes's hand closed, very lightly, upon my arm. "The cellar," he breathed, so quietly I felt rather than heard the words. "I told you, Watson, a house sealed at every door and window is not a house sealed altogether." I had no chance to answer him, for at that moment I heard the study door, the far door from the main hall, ease open with a soft, careful creak, and a figure, cloaked and hooded against recognition, slipped into the room. He crossed directly to the desk. He struck a match. The small, sharp sound of it seemed, in that silence, as loud as a pistol shot, and lit the lantern, and in its warm, familiar light, I saw, with no possibility of mistake, the face of Cornelius Ashworth. 21. Observation and confession. He worked with the swift, practiced efficiency of a man who has done the same task many times before, and I understood, watching him, precisely what Holmes had meant when he spoke of a workman's light rather than a haunting. Ashworth was not performing some ritual of guilt or grief. He was searching, his fingers running along the underside of the desk, tapping at panels, testing the join of drawer to frame, with the lantern held close so that its light might reach into every gap and shadow. He was, I understood in that moment, looking for something specific, and he had, by every appearance, spent a year searching for it, without success. Holmes rose, silent as a shadow, and stepped into the doorway. "You will not find it there, Mr. Ashworth," he said quietly. "I confess I am rather surprised it has taken you this long to exhaust the desk. You searched it, by my count, on no fewer than 9 separate occasions." Ashworth spun about, the lantern nearly falling from his grasp. His face, a face I had never before seen, though I had heard it described as unfailingly courteous, twisted into something closer to the face of a cornered animal than a solicitor of the city. "Holmes!" The word came out as barely more than a breath. And then, gathering himself, with the particular bravado of a man who believes he still holds some advantage, "You have no proof of anything. Trespassing in an empty house is hardly a hanging matter, and I dare say I could explain my presence here a dozen innocent ways." "You could try," said Holmes, "though I doubt you would enjoy the attempt. Shall I save us both the tedium of it, and simply tell you what you have spent a year failing to find?" Ashworth said nothing, but his silence was, in its way, an answer. "Josiah Trevelyan discovered, some 6 weeks before his death, that you had been systematically embezzling from his accounts for the better part of a decade. A slow, careful drain, small enough never to be noticed against the scale of his fortune, until an old man's habit of reviewing his own ledgers, late at night, by lamplight, finally caught what your falsified figures had been designed to hide. He said nothing to you directly. Instead, he summoned an outside solicitor, Mr. Whitfield, of Gray's Inn, whom I had the pleasure of interviewing 3 days ago, and instructed him to draw up a full and formal accounting of the fraud, together with a new codicil to his will, disinheriting you from your position as executor, and directing that the evidence of your theft be delivered to the authorities upon his death, whenever that death might naturally occur. "You cannot know this," Ashworth said, though the words carried no conviction at all. "I know it because Mr. Whitfield kept his own copy of every document he drew, precisely as good solicitors do, and was only too pleased to share them with me once I explained the circumstances of his former client's death. But you did not know that, did you, Mr. Ashworth? You believed, when Trevelyan confronted you, and he did confront you, I think, on that very last evening, else why would Miss Trevelyan have found him so angry over his dinner, that only one copy of the truth existed? You believed that if you could simply silence him before he acted upon it, and then locate and destroy whatever record he had made, the matter would die with him. It very nearly did. "I never meant," Ashworth began, and stopped himself. "Go on," said Holmes, his voice never rising, never hurrying. "You have carried this a year, Mr. Ashworth. I think, in truth, you are rather relieved to finally set it down. Pour you, Chire. What reasoning alone could not prove it is a peculiarity of confession which I have observed many times in the course of my association with Holmes, that a guilty man, once cornered, very often talks not because he has been outmaneuvered on every point, but because some private need in him, for understanding, for absolution, for the simple human relief of no longer carrying a secret alone, overtakes whatever caution remains to him. I watched that need overtake Cornelius Ashworth that night, slowly, and then all at once. "You cannot prove I poisoned him," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. "No physician found poison. No inquest suggested it. I have read every word written of his death, Holmes, and there is nothing that ties his heart to any hand but nature's own." "There you are very nearly correct," Holmes admitted, "and I confess I was startled to hear him concede so much. I cannot yet prove by the strict evidence of chemistry precisely what substance you introduced into his evening drink, nor precisely how you came to possess it, though Dr. Ainsworth's belated recollection of a faint discoloration about the lips gives me somewhere sound to begin looking, and looking, Mr. Ashworth, is a thing I do not abandon easily once I have begun it. But observe what I can prove, and consider whether a jury, presented with the whole of it together, will trouble themselves greatly over the one thread that remains, for the moment, incomplete." He began then to lay it out precisely as a man builds a wall, brick upon brick, each fact settling upon the last until no gap remained through which doubt might easily pass. "I can prove through Whitfield's sworn testimony that you were about to be exposed as a thief of some £11,000, accumulated patiently over 9 years of managing accounts a trusting client never thought to question. I can prove, through the physical wear upon your own cuffs and the reddish clay so distinctive to this garden alone, that you have entered this house repeatedly by an unlawful passage on a great many nights over the course of a full year. I can prove, through the note delivered to Miss Trevelyan and the forced gate at her own lodgings, that you have sought, by threat and by trespass, to frighten a grieving young woman away from an inheritance that is rightfully hers, and to frighten off precisely the investigation that now stands before you. And I can prove, through your own presence in this room tonight, lantern in hand, searching this desk for the 9th time by my own count and, I suspect, considerably more than that by yours, that you have spent a year of your life in the desperate pursuit of evidence you believed still existed and had not yet found. A jury need not hear a chemist's testimony to understand what manner of man does all of that, Mr. Ashworth, in the aftermath of a convenient and unwitnessed death. Ashworth's shoulders, which had held some rigid composure through even this recitation, seemed at last to fold inward upon themselves. "I never meant to kill him," he said, his voice raw. "I meant only to delay him, to buy myself time to repay what I had taken, to put things right before he could act. There is a preparation, Holmes. I will not pretend ignorance of it, not now, sold quietly to men of a certain circle, that mimics the failing of an aging heart when administered in small measure over several hours. I obtained a quantity of it some months before, against some vague fear that I might one day require it, though I told myself, even as I purchased it, that I never truly would. I did not know the dose would prove so certain, so complete. I thought, that it would only weaken him, frighten him, buy me the time I needed to disappear before the fraud came fully to light. I did not intend." He stopped, and something in his face crumpled, briefly, into something almost human. He kept saying, that last evening, that the truth had a way of surviving, whatever became of the men who tried to bury it. I thought it was an old man's sentiment. I did not understand, until it was too late, that he meant it quite literally. Aye, the lantern's secret. He hid the documents in the lantern itself, Holmes said. It was not a question. I searched it 100 times, Ashworth said bitterly. The base, the reservoir, every seam and joint, there is nothing there. I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, that Whitfield's documents had been destroyed, or never truly finished, and that I had spent a year risking the gallows for nothing at all. "You searched the lantern that stood upon this desk," said Holmes, "which is, I grant you, the very lantern Trevelyan used each evening of his working life. But you overlooked one small fact, Mr. Ashworth, which I confess took me some weeks to uncover myself. Trevelyan did not manufacture only one such lantern for his own use. He manufactured, in the final months of his life, a second, identical in every outward particular to the first, save for a false flaw beneath its oil reservoir, built by his own hand, in the workshop he still kept in the very trade that had made his fortune. He had it delivered, quietly, to Mr. Whitfield's chambers 3 weeks before his death, with instructions that it be returned to Miss Trevelyan only after a period of 1 full year had passed. A year, I believe, in which he hoped either to confront you himself or, failing that, to allow whatever guilt you carried to reveal itself under its own weight." Ashworth stared at the lantern in his own hands as though it had, quite suddenly, become a live and venomous thing. "Then this is precisely what you believed it to be. Trevelyan's original lantern, the one that stood upon this desk on the night he died, and nothing more. It has never held anything but oil and a wick, Mr. Ashworth. You have spent a year committing burglary against an object with no secret to give you." Holmes's voice, for the first time that night, carried something almost like pity. "The true lantern, and the documents concealed within it, has rested safely in Mr. Whitfield's keeping this entire year, and was delivered into Miss Trevelyan's hands, together with a full account of your fraud, 4 days ago. XXIV. The lamp that betrayed him." Ashworth's face, in that moment, held an expression I have seen many times in the course of my years beside Holmes. The particular collapse of a man who understands, all at once, that every calculation he has made has been built upon a foundation that was never real. "Then why," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "does it light itself? I have never, I swear to you, I have never once lit this lamp myself and left it burning. I strike my match, I search by its light, and I extinguish it again before I leave, every single time, exactly as I have tonight. If the lamp is nothing, if it holds no secret at all, then who has been lighting it on the nights I have not come? It was, I confess, the one thread of the mystery that even I had assumed Holmes's explanation of the cellar passage would resolve entirely. And I saw, in the brief pause before he answered, that Holmes intended to enjoy this final revelation rather more than the solemnity of the moment perhaps warranted. "Because you are not, and have never been, the only visitor this house has received in the past 3 weeks, Mr. Ashworth," he said. "Constable Reeves, at my instruction, has taken to lighting this lantern himself on those evenings you did not come, precisely at 11 o'clock, and precisely as it was lit on the night Trevelyan died, in order that the mystery might continue to burn in the public imagination, and that you, believing your secret still safe from discovery, might be tempted to return one final time. You did not steal into a house of ghosts, sir. You stole into a trap of my own careful construction, and you have walked into it as faithfully and as regularly as a man keeping an appointment." A whistle sounded from the street below, sharp, official, unmistakable. Ashworth did not run. I do not believe, in truth, he had the strength left in him to try. He simply sat down, heavily, in the very chair in which Josiah Trevelyan had died, and put his face in his hands, and said nothing further at all until Lestrade's men came to lead him away. Lestrade himself arrived within moments, somewhat out of breath from his own hurried climb up the front steps, and regarded the scene before him. Ashworth slumped in the dead man's chair, the lantern still burning upon the desk, Holmes standing quiet and composed beside it, with the particular expression of a man rapidly revising his own private skepticism into something closer to grudging admiration. "You were right, then," he said, to no one in particular, and then, gathering himself into his official manner, "Cornelius Ashworth, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Josiah Trevelyan, and on the further charge of fraud, and I must caution you that anything you say—" "He has already said a very great deal, Lestrade," Holmes interrupted gently, "and I believe you will find every word of it consistent with the evidence Mr. Whitfield and Dr. Ainsworth are prepared to offer. I would suggest you allow the man a moment to compose himself before you remove him. He has carried this particular weight alone for the better part of a year, and I do not believe a rougher handling is required to secure whatever remains of his cooperation." Ashworth lifted his face from his hands at that, and looked at Holmes with an expression I found, to my own considerable surprise, rather more grateful than resentful. "You did not need to say that," he said quietly. "I said it because it happened to be true, Mr. Ashworth, and I have found, over a long career, that even the guilty are generally owed the plain truth, however unflattering the circumstances in which it is delivered. You will answer, in the fullness of time, to a court and to whatever judgment the law sees fit to pass upon you. That is not my office, nor my particular satisfaction. My office was only to see the truth uncovered, and I believe, whatever else may be said of this night's work, that the truth has now been very thoroughly and very finally uncovered." He was led away within the quarter hour, quietly and without further incident, and Holmes and I remained a while longer in that study, the same study in which, a year before almost to the very week, Josiah Trevelyan had sat working through his final evening, certain, even then, that his patient trap would one day close. Holmes extinguished the lantern himself, carefully, with the same reverent attention he had shown its twin in Whitfield's cabinet, and we stood a moment in the sudden darkness, listening to the fog press soft and silent against the old glass windows. "It is a strange feeling, Watson," Holmes said at last, "to stand in the very room where a case both began and ended, now that the truth of it has finally been laid bare. I find I am rarely troubled by such moments, and yet this one, I confess, has left me rather more thoughtful than most. Because of Miss Trevelyan? Because of Miss Trevelyan, and because of an old man I never had the chance to meet, who built one final honest thing with his own 2 hands before the darkness took him, and trusted it to outlast every lie told against it. I do not know that I have ever encountered a client, living or dead, whose faith in patient truth was quite so thoroughly rewarded as his has been tonight. Dex Ex V. What was found? The documents recovered from the true lantern, delivered to Eleanor by Mr. Whitfield precisely as her uncle had instructed, and confirmed by Holmes's own examination before that final night, proved every particular of the case beyond any reasonable dispute. Ashworth's fraud, meticulously documented in Trevelyan's own careful hand, page after page of figures, cross-referenced against Whitfield's independent accounting, so thorough and so damning that even Ashworth's own solicitor, engaged some days later to manage what little defence remained available to him, was heard to remark privately that he had rarely seen a case built upon such unimpeachable paper evidence. And, folded within the same oilskin wrapping, a short letter, written by Trevelyan himself in the last week of his life, addressed to no one in particular, though I believe he intended it, in the end, for Eleanor. Holmes read it aloud to her, in our sitting room, some days after Ashworth's arrest, while the fire burned low and the fog pressed once more against the windows of Baker Street. "If you are reading this," he read, "then either I have found the courage to face Ashworth myself, or something has happened to prevent it, and the truth has had to find its own way to daylight without me. I built this second lantern with my own hands, as I built the first, many years ago, before I had any fortune worth protecting, or any family worth loving. It seemed to me a fitting place to leave the truth, for a lantern's whole purpose, after all, is to be trusted in the dark, to burn honestly when everything around it has gone black, and to ask for nothing in return but to be lit. I am an old man, and perhaps a foolish one, but I have always believed that the truth behaves very much the same way, that it will go on quietly burning, waiting to be found, long after the men who tried to smother it have given up and gone home. Whatever has become of me, Eleanor, do not be afraid of this house, nor of its shadows. There was never anything in it to fear but a man's own guilty conscience, and that, in the end, is a fire that always, always finds its own light." Eleanor wept then, at last and without restraint, in a manner I suspect she had not permitted herself once in the whole of the preceding year. Not composed grief, carefully managed for the benefit of solicitors and policemen and well-meaning neighbours, but the plain, exhausted weeping of a woman finally permitted to set down a burden she had carried alone for far too long. Holmes, to his credit, said nothing at all through the whole of it, and simply sat with her in the quiet until the worst of it had passed, which I have always counted among the gentlest things I ever saw him do. Ex vive, the trial. Cornelius Ashworth's trial, when it came the following spring, occupied a modest but respectable column of newspaper attention for the better part of a week. Modest, I think, because the case itself, once assembled, offered so little in the way of genuine dispute that even the more sensational papers found scant material for embellishment. The documentary evidence recovered from Whitfield's careful custody proved, exactly as Holmes had predicted, more than sufficient to establish the fraud beyond any reasonable question, and Dr. Ainsworth's revised testimony, supported at last by a chemist's careful analysis of a preparation found among Ashworth's own effects, closed the final gap in the case regarding the manner of Trevelyan's death. Ashworth did not, in the end, contest the charges with any great vigour. I am told by those who attended the proceedings more faithfully than I found the stomach to do myself, that he sat through the whole of it with the same hollow, defeated bearing he had worn on the night of his capture, and that when at last the verdict was returned, he received it with something closer to relief than despair. The particular relief, perhaps, of a man who has spent a year of sleepless nights dreading a reckoning that has, at long last, simply and finally arrived. He was sentenced to hang for the murder of Josiah Trevelyan, a sentence Holmes discussed with me only once, and briefly, some evenings after it was handed down. "I take no pleasure in it, Watson," he said, staring into the fire, with an expression I had come to recognize as the particular weariness that followed even his most successful cases. "I never do whatever the newspapers imagine of me. I take pleasure in the puzzle, in the patient assembly of scattered facts into a single true shape. What is done with that shape afterward, by judges and juries and the law of the land, is a business I have never found much satisfaction in, however necessary I understand it to be." You believe he might have been redeemed given a different turn of circumstance? Holmes considered this for a long moment. "I believe, Watson, that Cornelius Ashworth was not born a murderer, any more than most men are born to whatever crime eventually claims them. He was, I think, a man who told himself a great many small, comfortable lies over a great many years, that a little theft, taken slowly enough, harmed no one, that a debt postponed was a debt forgiven, that a threat delivered by an unsigned note was somehow gentler than the violence it plainly promised, until the lies accumulated into something he could no longer walk back from, and a frightened man, cornered by his own accumulated deceptions, did the one irreversible thing that no comfortable lie could ever again undo. It is, I have always found, the way a great many crimes are built, not in one dramatic moment of wickedness, but brick by patient brick, exactly as Trevelyan's own fortune was built, until the structure stands so tall that its builder can no longer see the ground it started from. XXVIB, the son who never knew. There is a small coda to Ashworth's story that I did not learn until some months after the trial had concluded, and which I set down here because I believe it belongs, however painfully, to the full and honest shape of this account. Holmes had continued, in his quiet way, to follow the threads of the case, even after the formal business of prosecution had run its course, and he learned, through a solicitor of his acquaintance who had handled certain of Ashworth's remaining affairs, that the son whose gaming debts had first set the whole tragedy in motion had returned to England only after his father's conviction, summoned home too late by a telegram he did not fully understand, and arriving in London to find his father already condemned, his own inheritance forfeit, and a name he had carried without particular thought his entire life now attached, in every newspaper in the city, to a hanging. I confess I did not expect to feel much sympathy for the boy, Watson, when I first learned of his existence, Holmes told me, some evening after this news had reached him. A young man's careless debts set his father upon a path to murder, and it would be easy enough to lay some measure of blame at his door for it. But I have thought better of that judgment since. He did not ask his father to steal on his behalf, nor to kill for it. He was, by every account I have gathered, entirely ignorant of the lengths his father went to on his account, believing only that a stern and distant man had, on 3 separate occasions, quietly and without explanation, settled debts that ought by rights to have ruined him. He has lost, in the space of a single telegram, a father he scarcely understood, a fortune he never knew the true cost of, and a name he will now carry, through no fault of his own choosing, as a kind of permanent shadow. You've spoken with him? Once, briefly, at his own request, for he sought me out some weeks after the trial, wishing, I think, simply to understand, from someone who had examined the whole affair more closely than any newspaper account could manage, precisely what manner of man his father had truly been. I told him what I believed to be true, Watson, that his father was neither the simple monster the popular press had made of him, nor the innocent victim of circumstance his own grief no doubt tempted him to imagine. I told him his father had loved him, genuinely, and to his own eventual ruin, and had also, quite separately and quite inexcusably, murdered a man who trusted him, and that both of these things could be true at once, without either one cancelling out the weight of the other. I do not know that it brought him much comfort. I am not certain, in truth, that comfort was ever mine to give him, but I believe he left our conversation understanding his father a little more completely than he had understood him before, and I have found, in my own long experience of grief and its aftermath, that understanding, however painful, is very often the only genuine comfort available to us at all. I asked Holmes some time later whether he thought Eleanor Trevelyan and this unfortunate young man, two lives so strangely tangled by a crime neither of them had committed, might ever cross paths, and whether some measure of mutual understanding might pass between them, each having lost, in such different and yet oddly parallel ways, a father figure to the very same terrible week of events. "I do not know, Watson," he said. "I am a detective, not a prophet, and I have long since given up predicting what the human heart will do with a tragedy once I have finished explaining its mechanics. I know only that both of them will carry this winter with them for the whole of their lives, in one shape or another, and that the kindest thing either you or I can do for either of them now is simply to let them carry it in their own time and in their own way, without our further interference. XXVI. A house reclaimed, I have promised you, at the start of this account, that I would not leave you with violence as the final note of this story, and I do not intend to break that promise now. Let me tell you, instead, of what became of Eleanor Trevelyan, and of the house that had frightened an entire street for the better part of a year. She did not sell number 14, as the anonymous note had once demanded of her, nor did she return to it at once, for grief and fear, once lodged deeply enough in a heart, do not depart simply because their cause has been explained and resolved. She remained some months longer in her modest Bloomsbury lodgings, visiting the house only occasionally, and always, in those early visits, in the company of either Holmes or myself, as though she needed the reassurance of witnesses before she could fully trust the rooms to hold nothing more sinister than the ordinary dust and quiet of an old house settling slowly back into use. It was Holmes, in fact, who first suggested, with a gentleness I had not always credited him capable of in matters outside the strict business of detection, that she might find it easier to reclaim the house, not all at once, but one small room at a time, beginning with whatever space in it held the least painful memory. She chose, in the end, the garden, the small, neglected plot behind the house, through which Ashworth had crept so many nights on his desperate search, and which Eleanor set about restoring, that first spring, with her own hands, planting exactly the sort of unglamorous, hardy English flowers her uncle had once grown there himself, before business and grief and the slow accumulation of years had left the plot to run wild. From the garden she moved inward, room by room, over the course of that spring and summer, the kitchen first, then the dining room, then, at last, in early autumn, the study itself, where she sat for the first time in nearly 2 years in her uncle's own worn leather armchair, and, by her own later account to Holmes, found it a good deal less frightening than she had spent a year imagining it to be. "I thought I would feel his death in that room," she told us, on one of the several visits she paid us at Baker Street in the months that followed. "Instead, Mr. Holmes, I find I feel his life there instead, his ledgers, his charts, that dreadful watercolor he was so proud of and had absolutely no talent for. It has taken me the better part of a year to understand that a room does not have to be haunted by how a man died, when it was so thoroughly, so completely, a room built out of how he lived. The lantern. Lit honestly she kept the true lantern. The second lantern, the one that had carried her uncle's final message safely through a full year of danger, upon her own writing desk, where I understand it remains to this day, though she has never, so far as I know, had occasion to light it, preferring instead to let it stand simply as what it had become, not an instrument of secrecy any longer, but a kind of quiet monument to a man's last careful act of love. The original lantern, the one that had caused so much fright and speculation along Baker Street, the one Reeves had dutifully lit each unwatched evening at Holmes's instruction, the one Ashworth had searched 100 times for a secret it had never once contained, she kept as well, though its history troubled her rather less than one might expect. It seems wrong, somehow, to be angry at an empty lamp, she said to Holmes once, with the small, wry smile that had, by then, begun to reappear in her more regularly than it had in all the months I had known her. It never lied to anyone. It simply burned, the way lanterns do, and let two very different men read two very different meanings into the very same light. She lights it herself now, I am told, on certain evenings, not at 11 o'clock, and not in secret, but openly, warmly, whenever she chooses to sit a while in her uncle's old study and go quietly through his ledgers, as he once did, though now, I understand, the business those ledgers record is a rather more honest one, managed under her own careful eye, with a new and thoroughly vetted solicitor whose accounts, Holmes assures me, are examined twice yearly by an independent hand, precisely as her uncle's ought always to have been. The neighbours no longer whisper about number 14. Old Mr. Fenwick, I am told, still checks his pocket watch from time to time when the study window glows of an evening, though I suspect now it is habit rather than dread that prompts him to it. Tommy Wick, the greengrocer's boy, delivers his late orders past that window without the smallest hesitation, and the house itself, that had stood for a year as a kind of dark question mark upon our street, has become instead something rather gentler. Not a mystery any longer, but a kind of remembrance, lit by a living hand for a man who trusted, even in his last hours, that the truth would find its way into the light. XXV, Mrs. Hudson's Vindication. I ought not to close this account without a word for Mrs. Hudson herself, whose trembling hands and quiet insistence had set the whole affair in motion long before either Holmes or I had troubled to take it seriously, and who bore, I think, rather more of the neighbourhood's early scepticism than she ever let on to either of us. She had been, in those first uncertain weeks, something of a figure of gentle amusement among the tradesmen who called at our door. The good landlady of Baker Street, some of them murmured, grown fanciful in her later years, seeing lights and shadows where sensible folk saw nothing at all. It is a particular kind of loneliness, I think, to be the first to notice a true thing and the last to be believed for it, and Mrs. Hudson bore that loneliness with rather more grace than I credited her at the time, when the truth at last emerged, when the newspapers that had once buried the matter in a paragraph of dismissive skepticism ran instead a full and sympathetic account of a grieving landlady's persistent instincts, vindicated at last by Sherlock Holmes's own investigation, I watched something in her posture change that I had not fully appreciated needed changing at all. She held herself, in the weeks that followed, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has been proven right about something that mattered, and who has earned, through patient and unglamorous persistence, a measure of the same respect the neighborhood had always so readily extended to Holmes himself. "I never doubted you, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes told her one evening, with a gravity I do not believe he often extended to matters of simple courtesy. "I want that understood plainly. I doubted only my own leisure to attend to the matter as promptly as it deserved, and I confess I allowed you to believe, for rather longer than was fair, that I doubted the substance of what you reported. That was an unkindness on my part, and I offer you a belated but entirely sincere apology for it." Mrs. Hudson, who had weathered a great many of Holmes's more careless unkindnesses over the years, with the practiced patience of a landlady who has long since stopped expecting apologies from any of her lodgers, appeared genuinely moved by this one. "I'll take the apology, Mr. Holmes, though I'll admit I'd half given up expecting it," she said, with a small, pleased smile that lingered rather longer than her usual brisk composure generally permitted. "And I'll tell you this besides. I've lived on this street the better part of 20 years, and I've watched a great many strange things come and go past my own front window in that time. I have never once been gladder to be believed." What the case left behind? I asked Holmes, some weeks after the whole affair had settled into its proper place among my growing collection of case notes, whether he counted the matter of the Baker Street lantern among his more satisfying successes. He considered the question with rather more care than I had expected. "It is not, I think, among my more intellectually elegant cases, Watson. The locked room element, once the cellar passage revealed itself, proved rather less remarkable than the poison, and the poison, once Ainsworth recovered his memory of the discoloration, proved rather less remarkable than the will to look for it in the first place. What I find myself remembering, when I think back upon it, is not the reasoning at all, but Miss Trevelyan's face, that first evening in her bare little parlour, when she told us she had carried her suspicion alone for a year, because no one else would trouble themselves to believe her. I have solved cleverer puzzles than this one, Watson, and I dare say I shall solve cleverer ones still before I am through. But I do not know that I have solved many that mattered quite so much to quite so patient and quite so lonely a client, and there is a satisfaction in that which no amount of intellectual elegance can quite match. You've grown sentimental in your old age, Holmes. I have grown, Watson, merely observant of what actually moves me, rather than what I am generally expected to claim moves me for the benefit of your published accounts. Do not, he added, with the ghost of a smile, put that particular observation into print. It would ruin my reputation for cold and unfeeling logic entirely, and I have worked a very long time to cultivate it. I have, of course, put it into print regardless, exactly as I promised him I would not. A small betrayal of confidence he has, over the years, come to expect of me, and, I rather think, to privately forgive. She be. A method restated. I asked Holmes once more, some weeks after that conversation, to set down for me, plainly, and without his usual impatience for explaining what he considered obvious, the essential method by which he had unravelled the whole affair, for I had resolved by then to set this account before you, and I wished to render his reasoning as faithfully as I could. It is nothing more, at its heart, than the discipline of taking every fact seriously before deciding which facts to discard, Watson, he said, settling into his chair with the particular patience he reserved for questions that touched upon the philosophy rather than merely the mechanics of his profession. Mrs. Hudson's trembling hands were a fact. The precise, unvarying hour of the lantern's lighting was a fact. Dr. Ainsworth's half-remembered smell of oil smoke in a room with a cold lamp was a fact, buried in an official report no one had troubled to reread. Miss Trevelyan's stubborn, unfashionable conviction that her uncle had not died naturally was a fact, however thoroughly the world around her insisted on dismissing it as grief. I did nothing more remarkable in the whole of this case than refuse to discard any of these facts simply because no immediate theory yet existed to connect them. I held them all, patiently, in mind together, and waited for the shape they were already forming to become visible, rather than forcing some premature and comfortable explanation upon them before they were ready to yield their true pattern. And the false indifference? The public retreat? That was merely method applied to human nature rather than to physical evidence, Watson. A frightened man, believing himself watched, grows more cautious. A frightened man, believing the danger past, grows careless. I required Ashworth careless, and so I manufactured, as thoroughly as I was able, the appearance of a case abandoned. It is not so very different, in principle, from the trap Trevelyan himself constructed with his false lantern. Each of us, in our separate ways, understood that the surest way to catch a guilty conscience is not to chase it directly, but to build a quiet, patient space in which that conscience, believing itself finally safe, will condemn itself far more thoroughly than any external accusation ever could. You sound, when you speak of Trevelyan, almost as though you consider him a kind of colleague. Holmes considered this with unusual seriousness. But he understood something I have spent the whole of my career learning by harder and more painful means, that the truth, given patience enough and craft enough, has a way of outlasting whatever lies are built to smother it. I do not know that I could improve upon that principle if I studied the matter for another 20 years. I am not entirely certain I would wish to. Holmes and I stood at our own window one evening not long after this conversation, watching that small yellow glow across the fog-softened street, and I asked him, half in jest, whether he thought there was anything to Trevelyan's little philosophy about truth and lanterns, or whether it was simply the sentiment of a dying man reaching for comfort where he could find it. Holmes was quiet for a long moment, his pipe glowing faintly in the dark of our own room. "I have built a career, Watson," he said at last, "upon the conviction that nothing stays hidden forever if one is patient enough and careful enough and willing to sit in the dark and watch for it." I confess I had never thought to put it quite so poetically as our Mr. Trevelyan managed, but I find, on reflection, that I have no serious quarrel with the sentiment. He drew on his pipe, and across the street, small and steady and entirely without mystery now, the lantern burned on. XX. A year later, I add this final chapter, some considerable time after the events I have already set down, for I think a story of this particular shape deserves to be followed a little further than its immediate ending, that you might know how thoroughly the light that once frightened an entire street came, in time, to mean something altogether gentler. I called upon Eleanor Trevelyan myself, quite by chance, in the autumn of the following year, a full 12 months and more since that first raw December night when Holmes and I had crouched in a dusty anteroom, waiting for a guilty man's careful footstep. I had been walking on a fine, crisp afternoon and found myself, without any particular design, passing along Baker Street at an hour when the low autumn sun struck the brick fronts of the houses opposite our own with a warmth that made the whole street look, for once, rather less grim than its winter self. Number 14's door stood open. A gardener's boy was carrying pots of late chrysanthemums up the front steps, and through the open door I caught the sound of a woman's voice, laughing at something, light and unguarded in a way I confess I had never once heard from Eleanor Trevelyan in the whole of our long acquaintance during the case itself. She saw me from the hall and came out at once, genuinely pleased, and pressed me to come in and take tea, which I was glad enough to do. The house itself had changed a great deal. The dust was gone entirely, of course, and the curtains stood open to the autumn light in every room, but it was more than mere housekeeping that had transformed it. There was, in the arrangement of fresh flowers upon the dining table, in the sound of a housemaid singing softly somewhere below stairs, in the general unguarded warmth of the place, something that spoke of a house genuinely, comfortably lived in once more, rather than merely occupied. "You've made it your own," I observed, as she poured the tea in the very study where, a year before, Cornelius Ashworth had knelt in the dark, searching a false trail by lantern light. "I have tried to," she said. "It has taken longer than I expected, Doctor. I do not think grief ever quite finishes its work on schedule, whatever the calendar might promise us. But I find, more days than not now, that I think of my uncle with a kind of gladness rather than only sorrow, that I remember the man who painted me so badly in this very garden, rather than only the manner of his death or the year of fear that followed it. She showed me, before I left, the small writing desk where the true lantern now stood, exactly as I had understood it would, polished, cared for, but unlit, a quiet object of remembrance rather than any longer a working tool. And beside it, I noticed, a second small frame had joined the watercolour portrait I remembered from her old Bloomsbury parlour, a modest, carefully rendered sketch, evidently her own hand rather than her late uncle's rather clumsier effort, of number 14 itself, its study window glowing warm and gold against a soft grey London evening. "I drew it myself, this past spring," she said, following my gaze. "I found I wanted some record of the house as it is now, rather than only as it was, a light in the window that means welcome rather than warning. I think my uncle would have liked it rather better than the watercolour he painted of me, if I am honest. He always did say I had the steadier hand for drawing, whatever encouragement he gave himself in the attempt." I asked, before I took my leave, whether she had any word of the young man, Ashworth's son, whom Holmes had spoken with so gently in the aftermath of the trial. "We have corresponded a little," she admitted, with a small, thoughtful hesitation. "It began almost by accident, a letter of condolence he felt he owed me, though I told him plainly he owed me nothing at all, and I felt rather that circumstance had made us both, in our separate ways, casualties of the very same terrible winter. We do not write often, but I find I do not mind that we write at all. There is a particular kind of understanding, Doctor, that passes between two people who have each lost someone to the very same tragedy, however differently that tragedy has left its mark upon them, and I have come to think there is more comfort in that understanding than in pretending the connection between us does not exist at all. I left number 14 that afternoon with a lighter heart than I had carried away from it on any of my previous visits, and I remember thinking, as I crossed back over to our own door at 221B, that Holmes had been entirely right in what he told me so many months before, in the quiet aftermath of Ashworth's confession, that this case, whatever its intellectual shortcomings as a puzzle, had mattered a very great deal indeed to the people it had touched, and that some victories, however unglamorous, are worth rather more than the cleverest reasoning could ever fully account for. I told Holmes of my visit that same evening, over supper, and described to him the little sketch Eleanor had drawn of the house, its window glowing warm against the London dusk. "A light that means welcome, rather than warning," he repeated, turning the phrase over as though testing its weight. "I find I rather like that, Watson. It occurs to me that it might serve as fitting enough description of the whole affair, from beginning to end. A story that began in dread and concluded in welcome, without ever once losing the same small, stubborn light that carried it the whole distance between. You ought to have been a poet, Holmes, rather than a detective. I leave the poetry to you, Watson, and to old men who build lanterns with secret compartments in the last honest week of their lives. I shall content myself with the reasoning, and trust you, as I always have, to find the proper words for whatever feeling the reasoning leaves behind it." He drew on his pipe then, and said nothing further on the matter that evening, and I did not press him, for I had learned, over our long years together, that some silences are better left exactly as full as they are, without any further words crowded into them. And so, my friend, the fog settles a little thicker over Baker Street, and the fire has burned down to embers, and it is time, I think, for both of us to rest. There is a particular comfort I have always found in mysteries that end not with violence as their final note, but with a light left honestly burning, a secret that turns out, in the end, to have been guarding something far gentler than it first appeared, not a ghost, not a curse, but simply the patient, stubborn honesty of a good man who trusted the truth to outlast him, and a niece who learned, at last, that the house she feared had never once stopped loving her back. Sleep well, tonight. Let the fog have the streets outside. Let the lantern burn steady in your mind, warm and unafraid, exactly as it burns still, on quiet evenings, in the window of number 14. Good night.